Hey everyone, welcome in. Tonight I've prepared some soft good night stories for a calm and easy ending to your day. Get cozy and relax. If you want more peaceful nights like this, subscribe. It's free and helps a lot. And before we begin, leave a good night comment so no one feels like they're alone listening. I broke up with my boyfriend after he set me up for a loyalty test. The moment I realized my boyfriend hadn't been afraid of losing me but had actually been studying me like a suspect, something in me went cold so fast it felt like a second heartbeat stopping. I'm 28, from Prague, and until 3 months ago I thought I was in the kind of relationship people envy quietly and then pretend not to. Not perfect, because I don't believe in perfect, but settled in a way that makes you unclench without noticing. The kind where you start leaving shampoo at each other's flats by accident, then by routine, then because one day you look up and realize there is no longer a difference between your place and my place, only where the good coffee is and whose windows get the softer morning light. His name was Tomas. He was 31, worked in commercial interiors, wore dark wool coats even when the weather didn't deserve them, and had that calm, dry humor that made even stupid errands feel intimate. He could make standing in line at Albert feel like a private joke. He had this habit of touching the small of my back when we crossed a street, and because it was gentle, because it never felt possessive at first, I mistook it for safety. We met in a tram shelter in Vinohrady during a freezing rain. I had an umbrella turned inside out by the wind and he laughed, then apologized for laughing, then helped me wrestle it shut like it was a wild animal. We ended up on the same tram, and then somehow in the same conversation, and by the time I got off he had asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime. It was not cinematic, it was better than cinematic. It was ordinary in a way that felt trustworthy. For the first 8 or 9 months, I genuinely believed I had found a man who was serious without being heavy, affectionate without being performative, attentive without being invasive. He remembered tiny things. That I hated celery. That I loved old churches not because I was religious but because silence always sounded different inside them. That when I was anxious, I cleaned surfaces that were already clean. He once brought me a paperback by Bohumil Hrabal because I had mentioned, weeks earlier, that my father used to read Hrabal aloud when I was sick as a child. That is the part that still embarrasses me. Not that I loved him. I don't think love is embarrassing. What embarrasses me is how thoroughly I let those thoughtful details outweigh the uglier ones when they started appearing. At first the uglier things were small enough to excuse. He'd ask strange, casually sharp questions after nights out. Not "did you have fun?" but "who was there?" followed by "anyone I don't know?" said with a smile that made it sound playful until I noticed he always remembered the answers. If a male colleague's name came up twice, Tomas stored it somewhere behind his eyes. If I took too long to answer a message because I was in meetings, he wouldn't accuse me of anything exactly, but he'd say, "Busy day?" in that overly neutral tone people use when they want you to know they are not neutral at all. When I pushed back, he always had a story ready. His ex had cheated on him. His father had cheated on his mother. He had trust issues, which is a phrase I eventually came to hate because it gets used like a medical note passed across a desk, as if it explains behavior and excuses it in the same breath. I tried to be compassionate. I really did. My own previous relationship had ended badly too, though in a different way. My ex, Martin, hadn't cheated. He had simply become someone else so slowly that by the time I noticed, I was already living with a stranger who corrected the way I spoke to waiters and told me I was too sensitive whenever I objected. So when Tomas admitted early on that betrayal had made him suspicious, I thought honesty about damage was a good sign. I thought self-awareness meant self-control. It doesn't. Sometimes it just means someone has learned therapeutic vocabulary before learning decency. The first real argument we had happened over a message I never should have had to defend. I was at lunch with 2 coworkers, Ines and Pavel, from the architecture magazine where I work. We had been covering a design fair and our editor wanted a same-day piece, so we stayed out, ate quickly, and complained about fonts and deadlines like miserable little professionals. Pavel made a joke in the group chat afterward about me choosing the worst soup in Prague. I laughed and sent back a photo of the bowl with a skull emoji. That evening Tomas saw my phone light up while I was in the shower. When I came out, he was sitting on my bed with my phone beside him, face down, the screen black. He said, too calmly, "Pavel seems familiar." I remember stopping with a towel around my shoulders and looking at him in a way that must have already contained a warning, because he immediately lifted both hands and said, "I didn't read anything. I just saw the name. You picked up my phone. It lit up. That is not the same as you having the right to touch it." He shrugged and then said the line I would hear variations of 100 times before we ended. "If there's nothing wrong, why are you reacting like this?" People who ask that are almost never trying to understand your reaction. They are trying to make you distrusted. I told him he was changing the subject. He told me I was being defensive. I told him privacy and secrecy were not the same thing. He said couples who are serious shouldn't care so much about privacy. I remember standing there feeling the floor tilt slightly under the argument, because I could already hear what he was doing, making boundaries sound suspicious. He apologized later. He made pasta, opened a bottle of red wine, kissed my forehead, said he was ashamed that old experiences still got into his head. I accepted it because I wanted to believe apology meant improvement instead of merely another loop in the pattern. There were other moments. At a friend's birthday in Zizkov, he asked why I smiled like that at a bartender who had literally asked if I wanted another drink. At Christmas, when I went to Brno to see my sister Lenka and stayed one extra night because of train delays, Tomas sent a message at nearly midnight saying, "You could have called sooner. I was starting to think you enjoyed leaving me guessing." He said it was a joke. It wasn't. Still, it never got bad enough all at once. That's what makes these things difficult to explain after the fact. If he had been monstrous from the beginning, I would have left early and everyone would understand. But he was loving on Monday, moody on Thursday, remorseful on Friday, charming on Saturday, and by Sunday I would feel dramatic for having been upset at all. My friends didn't all like him. Ines especially didn't. Ines is Spanish, though she's lived in Prague so long that she swears in Czech better than most Czech people. She is one of those women who can spot wrath through painted wood. She met Tomas maybe 4 times before she leaned across a cafe table, stirred her espresso without drinking it, and said, "I don't think he likes women very much." I laughed because the phrasing caught me off guard. What does that even mean? It means he likes what women do for him. The reassurance, the admiration, the softness, the structure. But every time a woman acts like a full person around him instead of a mirror, he looks offended. I told her she was being unfair. She said maybe. Then she asked whether Tomas ever asked questions he already thought he knew the answer to, just to watch how I answered. I didn't reply, which was answer enough. Even then, I stayed. I stayed because when things were good, they were very good. We cooked together. We took trains to little towns for no reason and drank bad coffee in beautiful squares. He met my mother, Hannah, and was so attentive with her that she called me afterward and said, "He looks at you like you matter." It nearly broke me later, remembering that. Not because she was wrong at the time, but because I don't know anymore whether he looked at me like I mattered or like I belonged to a category of things he feared losing control of. Everything that happened after started, as these humiliations always do, with something that seemed too small to notice. A man followed me on Instagram. His name was Alexander. The account looked real, not polished enough to feel fake, not full of model photos or nonsense quotes. Just a normal-looking man in his early 30s, based in Vienna, judging by the tags. Photos of buildings, coffee, a bike, one blurry concert, one grandmother. Mutual followers through the design fair circuit, which made sense because my work involved events, galleries, and architecture spaces all over Central Europe. He liked 2 of my recent stories about an exhibition and replied to one with a simple comment about a chair installation. I answered politely because that's what I do when someone seems normal and is talking about work-adjacent things. For the first few days, there was nothing inappropriate. He asked about the exhibit. He said he was coming to Prague for a project. He knew a surprising amount about interiors and lighting design. He was funny in a dry, restrained way. Once or twice I even mentioned the conversation to Tomas, mostly because Tomas liked design talk and I thought he'd find it interesting that someone from Vienna was working with the same fair organizers. If I had hidden it, maybe I would understand where Tomas later got the audacity. But I didn't hide anything. I said, almost absent-mindedly one evening while we were making dinner, that Austrian guy from Instagram is coming to Prague next week for a hotel project. Tomas looked up from slicing garlic. What Austrian guy? Alexander. I told you. He works in interiors. He held my gaze a fraction too long before returning to the cutting board. Right. That should have bothered me more than it did. A few days later, Alexander's messages shifted. Still subtle. He said I seemed easy to talk to. He said Prague must look better through my eyes than it did through anyone else's. That kind of sentence. Polished, slightly intimate, but deniable. I didn't encourage it. I answered later, shorter. I mentioned Tomas twice in natural ways. Once I literally wrote, "My boyfriend loves that cafe," because I wanted the point made without a formal speech. Alexander reacted with what I thought was appropriate embarrassment. He apologized if he had come across wrongly. He said he respected that. Then he asked if I'd still be willing to suggest some places in Prague, since he'd be there only 3 days. Again, work adjacent. Again, normal enough. I suggested 2 places in Mala Strana for coffee and a wine bar near Nemsti Miru. That should have been the end of it. Instead, he asked if I'd be there one evening and if he could buy me 1 drink as thanks. I said no. Politely, clearly, immediately. I said I don't meet men from Instagram one-on-one when I'm in a relationship, and that I hoped his trip went well. He replied with a laughing message saying fair enough, then went quiet for almost a week. If the story had ended there, I wouldn't be writing this. The night everything came apart was a Friday in early autumn, one of those Prague evenings when the air suddenly smells like damp stone and cigarette smoke and cold metal from tramlines. Tomas had been slightly off all week, though I couldn't have said why. Too affectionate in public, too withdrawn in private. I asked twice if something was wrong. Both times he said no. The second time he even smiled and kissed my hand like I was imagining things. That Friday I was meant to meet Ines and her cousin Marta for wine after work. Tomas had plans with an old university friend, Oscar, somewhere in Karlin. We parted normally. No tension, no argument. He kissed me outside my office, told me not to stay out too late, then added, "Try not to let strange men buy you drinks," and laughed when I rolled my eyes. At the time I thought it was just one of his annoying little jokes. In hindsight it makes my skin crawl. We were at a narrow wine bar in Vinoreti, the kind with candles stuck into old bottles and too many mirrors. Ines was late, Marta was in the bathroom, and I was standing near the bar ordering another glass when someone said, in accented Czech, "I had a feeling I might find you somewhere with better taste than the tourist places." I turned and there he was. Alexander. Exactly like his photos. Same smile, same coat, same irritatingly careful stubble. He looked pleasantly surprised, but not enough. Not in the way a person genuinely surprised would. I remember my stomach tightening before my mind had caught up. I said, "What are you doing here?" He lifted one shoulder. "A recommendation led me here. I should have left immediately. I know that now. But when something feels wrong in a social setting, especially for women, we are trained so deeply to remain polite for one more minute that sometimes that minute ruins everything." I told him I was with friends. He said of course, no problem, he only wanted to thank me in person for the recommendations. He asked if he could buy me that drink I had refused before. I said no again, firmly this time. Then he did something I still replay because it made everything undeniable. He stepped closer and lowered his voice like we were sharing a secret. "Your boyfriend doesn't have to know every conversation you have. There are sentences that don't just sound wrong. They sound placed, manufactured, delivered." I took half a step back and said, "I think you should leave me alone." Instead of looking embarrassed, he looked almost alert, as if waiting for the next line in a script. Then he smiled again and said, "You're very loyal." It is difficult to explain how instantly the room changed for me. I cannot prove why that sentence hit me the way it did except to say that every instinct I had began screaming at once. Not because it was creepy, though it was. Not because it was flattering, because it wasn't. But because it sounded evaluated. Not admired, evaluated. Before I could answer, I heard a short laugh behind me. Not his. Tomas. I turned and there he was, standing 2 meters away near the end of the bar, hands in his coat pockets, smiling like someone had just pulled off a surprise party. I don't think my face changed immediately. I think for one very strange second I simply looked from one man to the other like my brain refused to put the pieces together because the picture was too stupid to be real. Tomas took a step toward us and said, "Okay, maybe this has gone far enough." I said, "What?" Alexander put both hands up in a theatrical surrender and took a step back, suddenly looking awkward rather than smooth. Tomas came closer, touched my elbow, and said in the soothing tone people use on frightened animals, "Clara, relax. That was the first spark. Not the setup, not the deceit, the word relax. I pulled my arm away and asked again, louder, what is this? A couple at the far end of the bar looked over. I barely noticed. Tomas glanced at Alexander, then back at me, and I could see him calculating how to frame it. That was maybe the most insulting part. He didn't look ashamed, he looked managerial. He said, I wanted to prove something to myself. I stared at him. Alexander, to his credit or perhaps his cowardice, muttered, maybe I should go. Tomas said, wait, as if they were colleagues finishing a presentation. I said, prove what? Tomas exhaled and gave me that pained, patient look he used when he wanted to suggest I was overreacting before I had technically reacted enough to justify it. Just that I could trust you. For a second I honestly thought I might laugh. Not because it was funny. Because it was so grotesquely humiliating that my body didn't know where else to put the shock. You set me up? He said, it wasn't like that. Alexander looked at the floor. I turned to him and said, did he ask you to message me? He hesitated, which was its own answer, but Tomas said quickly, it started as a joke. A joke? Yes, and then, you had someone contact me for weeks. It was only to see. To see what? If I'd cheat? If I'd flirt enough? If I'd fail some exam I didn't know I was taking? People nearby were definitely listening now. I didn't care. Tomas dropped his voice, the way people do when they want public conflict to become your fault instead of theirs. Please don't make a scene. That was the second spark. Hotter. I said, very clearly, you made a scene the moment you turned my relationship into an experiment. Marta had come back by then and was standing frozen a few steps away, clutching her bag and staring between us. She asked, Clara, what's happening? I didn't answer her because my entire focus had narrowed to Tomas, who now finally looked uneasy, not because of what he had done but because it wasn't going the way he had imagined. And that is the thing I need people to understand whenever this story comes up and someone says he was insecure, he had trauma, he just wanted reassurance. No, a man seeking reassurance looks relieved when he gets it. Tomas looked disappointed that I was angry. That's different. He did not want trust. He wanted authority. He wanted to quietly check whether I behaved correctly when watched. I asked Alexander if Tomas had told him I knew. He said no. I asked if this had all been planned before Tomas joked that morning about strange men buying me drinks. He said yes, sort of, he was sorry, he hadn't realized it would go this far. Tomas snapped at him then, that's enough. I looked at Tomas and said, you brought another man into my life to test me. He said, you passed. Passed. I don't know if I will ever hear a worse word in a romantic context. I said, I am not your child. I am not your employee. I am not a fucking exam. He reached for my hand. I moved away before he could touch me. By then Ines had arrived. She had the kind of timing usually reserved for avenging spirits. She took one look at my face, then at Tomas and Alexander, and said, what did he do? Nobody answered quickly enough, so I did. He arranged a loyalty test. Ines blinked once. Then she laughed in disbelief, not kindly, and said to Tomas, you are out of your mind. He straightened and did that wounded pride thing some men do when another woman openly despises them. This is between me and Clara. Ines said, you recruited a stranger to harass your girlfriend in public. It stopped being private the second you involved extra personnel. I should probably say here that Alexander insisted later he didn't think of it as harassment, that Tomas had told him I was flirtatious online and that it was all meant to be light. I don't care. A man old enough to pay taxes is old enough to know that pretending romantic interest in someone as part of a test is humiliating, invasive, and pathetic. I picked up my coat and bag. Tomas followed me out into the street. Prague was cold and wet and yellow with streetlight. Trams rattled past like nothing important had happened, which was infuriating in its own way. He kept pace with me, saying my name over and over in that calm voice that was starting to fray around the edges. Clara, Clara, stop, just let me explain. I stopped so abruptly he nearly walked into me. Explain what? The strategy? The timeline? Did Oscar help too? Was everyone taking notes? Was there a scoring system? He said, you're twisting it. I remember that with perfect clarity because it was the exact moment something final and irreversible happened inside me. There was no shame in him. Not real shame, only irritation that I was making his behavior difficult to defend. I asked, how long? He was silent. How long had you been planning this? A couple of weeks. And why? He rubbed a hand over his face and finally said what I think was the truth beneath all the cleverer excuses. Because lately I felt you slipping away. I stared at him. So instead of talking to me, you trapped me. He shook his head. I didn't trap you. I gave you an opportunity to prove. I actually interrupted him by laughing, loud and ugly. Prove what? That I am faithful enough for you? Tomas, do you hear yourself? Then he said something I will never forgive, not because it hurt, but because it revealed everything. If it bothered you this much, maybe it hit a nerve. Meaning what, exactly? That only guilty people object to being deceived? That innocents should respond to surveillance with gratitude? I told him we were done. He went still in that dangerous, brittle way people do when they believe a conversation has crossed from emotion into consequence. He said, "Don't be ridiculous." I said, "I am breaking up with you." For this? No. For what this means. He looked at me like I had become unreasonable in real time. One mistake. That wasn't one mistake. It was planning. It was lying. It was involving another person to manipulate me. It was you deciding I needed to be tested at all. He reached out again, but only to touch my sleeve this time, as if smaller contact might make him seem gentler. You're angry. Sleep on it. I stepped back. Do not tell me how to process being humiliated. He changed tactics then, because that's what men like Tomas do when one script fails. First he tried reason. Then he tried sorrow. He said he had been scared because I seemed distant. He said maybe he had handled it badly, but the result proved I was loyal. He said he was relieved. He said he loved me. He said everybody has weaknesses. He said if I left over this, I was punishing honesty because at least he confessed. He said if our relationship were strong, we would survive one ugly misstep. That last line almost worked on the version of me who existed 6 months earlier. But there is a point where a person suddenly sees the architecture of the whole building, not just the cracked tile in front of them. Standing there on that wet street, with him trying to negotiate the terms of my own humiliation back down into a misunderstanding, I understood that the loyalty test wasn't an isolated event. It was just the first time his private logic became visible enough that I couldn't romanticize it. The phone checking, the suspicious jokes, the constant probing, the way every boundary became evidence, the way every explanation still ended with me needing to soothe him. The way his insecurity always appointed itself judge. I said no again. Then I walked to the tram stop while he stood behind me calling my name. I didn't turn around. That night I went to Inés's flat instead of my own because Tomas had a key to mine and I couldn't bear the thought of him showing up before I had decided what to do. Inés made tea I didn't drink and put a blanket around my shoulders like I was in shock, which maybe I was. Marta sat beside me on the sofa and kept saying, "I cannot believe this. I cannot believe men really do things like this." It would have been funny if it hadn't been my life. At around 1 in the morning, Tomas started messaging. First apologies. Then explanations. Then long paragraphs about fear and trauma and how he only wanted certainty because he was serious about our future. Then, when I stopped answering, the messages shifted. He said I was throwing away something real over pride. He said most women would be glad to have a boyfriend who cared enough to worry. He said Alexander never even touched me, so why was I acting as though Tomas had violated me? He put violated in quotation marks. That detail still makes me furious. I blocked him for the night. The next day I went home with Inés while Tomas was supposedly at football with Oscar. I packed the essentials first: documents, laptop, chargers, 2 weeks of clothes, my grandmother's ring, toiletries, notebooks, the ugly green sweater I sleep in when I'm sick. I hadn't officially moved in with Tomas, but we had become so entangled in each other's spaces that half my life was at his flat and some of his was at mine. That kind of entangling is less dramatic than films make it. It is mostly toothbrushes, cables, receipts, winter tights, medication, books with bent corners, and the stunned feeling of seeing your own things in someone else's drawers after you have stopped trusting them. He came back earlier than expected. I was in the bedroom zipping a bag when I heard his voice in the hall. Then Inés, cold as January, saying, "She's busy." He entered anyway. I have never seen such a specific expression before or since. Anger mixed with confidence, as though he truly believed that once he saw me physically leaving, he would be able to stop it by force of narrative alone. He said, "You brought her here?" I said, I brought a witness. Ines actually smiled at that. Tomas ignored her and looked at the bags. This is insane. I kept folding clothes because if I had looked at him too long, I might have started screaming. He said, Clara, enough. We need to talk like adults. We did. Yesterday. No, yesterday you performed for your friend. That was when I did look up. Performed? Yes. You got embarrassed in public and now you're doubling down because you don't want to look foolish. There is almost a relief in hearing something cruel enough that it clears the fog. Until then, some tiny guilty part of me had still been wondering whether I was overreacting. That sentence killed it. I said, I look foolish because I dated a man who staged an audition for my integrity. He told me I was twisting everything again. He said he had never actually believed I'd cheat. He said he only wanted proof because trust mattered to him. He said he thought I would understand once emotions settled. Then, because he could never resist making himself the injured party, he said, do you know how humiliating this is for me? I almost admired it, the athleticism required to say that while I was packing my belongings because he had hired emotional bait to test my character. I said, good, that landed. He flinched. Then he tried one final strategy, the one designed to pull me back into caretaking. His voice dropped. He looked tired, fragile, boyish, even. He said, I was afraid, Clara. I loved you and I was afraid. And maybe in some pathetic, self-serving way that was true. But fear does not excuse control. Love does not excuse surveillance. Being afraid to lose someone does not give you the right to build traps and call them proof. I told him I could have forgiven fear. I could even have forgiven one ugly conversation, one stupid accusation, one insecurity spoken badly. What I could not forgive was premeditated deceit. The planning, the deliberate recruitment, the months of making me feel as if his mistrust was my responsibility to soothe, only for him to escalate it into a test when reassurance wasn't enough. He said, so that's it? A year and a half gone? And I said, number. A year and a half revealed. He didn't speak after that. I think he realized then that there was no emotional angle left that would get me back inside the conversation on his terms. I left with 2 bags, a winter coat, and a strange sense of physical lightness that felt almost nauseating. The aftermath was uglier than the breakup itself, mostly because humiliation loves an audience and people always think there are 2 sides to every story, even when one side is I manipulated you for data. Tomas told some mutual friends that he had made a stupid joke that spiraled, that I had reacted drastically because I was already looking for a way out. One of his friends, Petra, who had always been kind to me but was his cousin first, sent me a message saying, he's devastated and says he was just insecure. Couldn't you at least talk to him once more without everyone around? The wording bothered me, without everyone around, as if the problem had been witnesses rather than conduct. My mother didn't understand at first. Not fully. She is from that generation that sometimes hears he was jealous and translates it into he cared too much. When I told her the whole thing, she went quiet for a long time, then said, that is not love. That is inspection. It was the best sentence anyone gave me. Lenka understood immediately. She said if a man ever tested her like that, she would mail his possessions 1 sock at a time to different districts. Ines, unsurprisingly, was furious in a sustained, almost professional way. She said what upset her most was that he would probably go through life describing himself as a man who had been abandoned for one insecurity, instead of as a man who orchestrated deception because he believed his feelings entitled him to evidence. Alexander messaged me once. A long apology. He said Tomas had framed it as a harmless experiment, that he knew it sounded terrible now, that he felt manipulated too. I never answered. Maybe that was unfair. But I had no energy left to parse levels of male stupidity like legal categories. For about a month afterward, Tomas kept trying different doors. Email, because he was blocked on messaging apps. A letter slipped under my flat door, because apparently we were in the 19th century. A bouquet of white roses I didn't ask for and left downstairs in the entryway until the petals browned. He once waited outside my office, which angered me so much I nearly lost the ability to speak. He said he only wanted 10 minutes. I said if he followed me again I'd call the police, and I meant it. That was maybe the hardest part to explain to people who thought I was being dramatic. The loyalty test did not just hurt my feelings. It changed the texture of reality around him. After that, every attempt he made to reach me felt contaminated. Because once someone has proven willing to engineer your emotional environment without your knowledge, how are you supposed to relax into any contact at all? Every apology becomes strategy, every tear becomes pressure, every chance encounter becomes suspect. That is what he broke, more than the relationship itself. He broke the assumption of clean dealing. And the truth is, even before the test, some part of me had already been shrinking. I noticed it in retrospect. How often I edited my stories about my day because certain names would trigger questions. How often I reassured him preemptively. How often I felt relieved, absurdly relieved, when a social event passed without incident. That is not how love is supposed to feel. Love can be work, yes. It can be compromise, yes. It can be frightening, but it should not feel like you are continually sitting an exam designed by the least generous version of your partner. A few weeks after the breakup, I saw a couple outside a bakery near Jericho Z Podabrod. They were laughing over something stupid, and the woman reached over and wiped sugar from the man's coat. It was such a small, unimportant gesture, but I had to stop walking because I realized I had spent so long managing suspicion that I had forgotten how light trust looks from the outside. I'm not saying I was perfect in the relationship. I could go cold when hurt. I hate repeating myself, and sometimes that becomes silence instead of clarity. I am too proud about needing space. There were days when work consumed me and I probably seemed distant. Maybe I did make Tomas feel insecure. Maybe he sensed the truth before I admitted it to myself, which was that I was getting tired of proving my harmlessness. But none of that justifies what he did. Normal people say, "You seem far away lately. Are we okay?" They do not create a false romantic threat and then step out of the shadows to grade your reaction. What still stings most is not even that he mistrusted me. Mistrust can sometimes be ugly, honest human weakness. What stings is that he believed my dignity was an acceptable price for his reassurance. He thought if the result comforted him, the method would become forgivable. He thought passing the test would make me grateful rather than furious. That tells you everything about the kind of relationship he believed we had. Not a partnership between equals, but a system in which he was entitled to private certainty and I was expected to absorb the cost. So yes, I broke up with him. Not in a dramatic blaze, not because I wanted revenge, not because there was someone else, not because I was secretly looking for an exit. I broke up with him because the minute your partner starts manufacturing temptations to measure your behavior, the relationship stops being a relationship and starts becoming surveillance with pet names. And if I'm honest, the breakup itself was not the moment I lost him. I lost him the moment he smiled in that bar like he had just solved me. Story 2. My father kept asking me to be the bigger person, so I finally asked him a question that only had two answers. I don't know if there is a graceful way to explain how you end up asking your own father to choose between you and his wife, because by the time words like that leave your mouth, grace is already dead and buried. People only hear the ultimatum and not the 10,000 smaller humiliations that built it, brick by brick, until one day you are standing in a dining room with your hands shaking and your whole childhood in your throat. I'm 29, I'm from Wrocław, and I used to be the kind of person who believed that if I stayed calm enough, polite enough, reasonable enough, other people would eventually feel ashamed of treating me badly. That is, apparently, not how family works. My name is Amelia, my father is Tomas, my mother was Marta, my stepmother is Sabine. If I sound formal naming them like that, it's because I have spent the last 3 years trying to explain this story to relatives who keep trimming away the ugly parts until all that remains is, Amelia said something unforgivable to her father. It makes it sound like I woke up one morning, drank my coffee, and decided to ruin lunch. It makes it sound like the sentence came first and the hurt came after. It was the other way around. When I was a child, my father was the sort of man everyone liked. He was handsome in a very ordinary, dependable way, broad shoulders, deep laugh, always the first to carry heavy bags for elderly women in our building, always the one neighbors called when a shelf needed fixing. He worked for a logistics company and wore pale blue shirts that my mother ironed while he watched football and shouted friendly arguments at the television. My mother would roll her eyes, but she smiled more often than not. We were not rich, we were not dramatic. We were the kind of family other people would call stable. My mother taught literature at a secondary school. She smelled like perfume and paper and black tea. She loved old Polish poems, butter cookies, and those long Sunday walks where you don't really go anywhere but still come home tired and happy. When I think of safety, I still think of her voice reading at the kitchen table while the radiator clicked and dusk turned the windows blue. So when my parents separated, it did not happen in a way that made sense to me. There was no long period of obvious fighting, no plates thrown, no months of sleeping in separate rooms that a teenager could point at and say, well, yes, that was coming. There were only small shifts in the atmosphere. My father started traveling more for work. My mother got quieter. They began speaking in those careful adult tones that children are supposed to mistake for calm. I was 16, old enough to know something was wrong and young enough to still believe adults would eventually fix it. Then one Thursday night my mother sat on the edge of my bed and told me my father had formed a relationship with someone else. That was the phrase she used, as if he had opened a bank account rather than broken our family in half. The someone else was Sabine Richter, a project consultant from Dresden who had worked with him for almost a year. She was divorced, polished, efficient, spoke excellent Polish with a German accent that everybody in his office found elegant, and apparently she made my father feel seen. That was another phrase I came to hate. Men do things that wreck everyone around them and then call it wanting to feel seen. At first he denied it was serious. Then he said the marriage had been over for years. Then he said he had not wanted to hurt anyone. Then, when enough time had passed and everyone was exhausted, he began talking about happiness as if it were a divine right that excused every lie told in pursuit of it. My mother never screamed. That almost made it worse. She became very still, very precise. She separated their documents, spoke to a lawyer, kept teaching, kept buying groceries, kept asking me whether I had enough money for tram tickets. I heard her crying only once. It was late. I had gotten up for water and saw the kitchen light under the door. She was sitting at the table with both hands over her face. She was not crying loudly. It was the kind of crying that sounded embarrassed to exist. My father moved out 3 weeks later. If you have never been the daughter people expect to be mature, let me explain what maturity really means in a broken family. It means adults look at you with pleading eyes and ask you not to make things harder. It means your mother says, I don't want you caught in the middle, while clearly standing in blood. It means your father says, you'll understand when you're older, which is what selfish people say when they need time for you to normalize what they've done. It means everyone keeps congratulating you for being composed, while not one person asks where all the rage is supposed to go. Sabine entered my life with casseroles and careful smiles. The first time I met her was in a cafe near the Oder, because my father said neutral ground would be easier. I remember everything about that afternoon because I spent years afterward wishing I had listened to the warning inside me. She wore a cream coat and a thin gold chain and spoke to me like someone interviewing for a role she had already been promised. She told me she knew this was difficult. She said she hoped, in time, we could build our own bond. She called me mature 4 times in 1 hour. Even then I noticed that adults use maturity as bait when they want children to swallow pain without choking on it publicly. I did not like her, but dislike would have been manageable. The real problem was that Sabine did not merely want my father. She wanted the whole architecture of his life rearranged so neatly that no one could accuse her of entering a ruin and claiming the land. She wanted continuity without guilt. She wanted to be treated as if she had always belonged. At first it was little things. My room at my father's flat became the guest room within 6 months because, as Sabine gently explained, it was silly to keep a whole room for me when I was hardly there. My books were packed into boxes. My desk disappeared. The framed photograph of me and my mother on the Baltic coast vanished from the shelf and was replaced by a black and white print of Prague that Sabine liked because it made the space more adult. When I confronted my father, he rubbed his forehead and said they simply needed the room to function better. He said I was welcome anytime. I asked where exactly I was supposed to sleep. He said the sofa bed in the study was comfortable. I remember staring at him and thinking, with the clarity only grief gives, that there are men who will dismantle their own daughter's place in their home while insisting the door remains open. Still, I tried. God, I tried. I had dinner with them twice a month. I answered Sabine politely. I accepted birthday gifts chosen by a woman who did not know me and never quite cared to. I endured holidays split into awkward pieces. Christmas Eve at my mother's flat was candles, pierogi, old carols, my Aunt Clara laughing too loudly, my grandmother Danuta fussing over whether I had eaten enough. Christmas Day at my father's place became white tablecloths, expensive wine, Sabine's exacting standards, and my father's constant scanning of my face as if I were a bomb he hoped would remain inactive until dessert. What hurt was not that Sabine disliked my mother. That would have at least been honest. What hurt was that she treated my mother like a former tenant whose belongings had not yet been fully cleared from the property of my father's life. She would say things like, "Tomas never liked that color in curtains," about curtains my mother had sewn by hand. Or, "He seems much lighter these days," while glancing at me to see if I understood the comparison. Once, while rearranging a cupboard in front of me, she held up one of my mother's old ceramic mugs that had somehow ended up at my father's flat and asked, smiling, "Should we finally let go of some relics?" Relics. That was the first time I nearly walked out without a word. My mother told me not to engage. She was proud in a way that could look almost cruel if you didn't know what it cost her. "Never fight for dignity with people who benefit from pretending you don't deserve it," she said. "They will only call you emotional and themselves practical." But I was 17, then 18, then 19, and it is hard to live by wise sentences when you still want your father to wake up guilty. He never did. What he did do was ask. Constantly. He asked me to understand. He asked me to come to dinner. He asked me not to be cold. He asked me to stop making Sabine feel unwelcome. He asked me to remember he was still my father. That last one used to make me almost laugh. As if fatherhood were a museum pass he could flash whenever criticized. As if the title could survive untouched while the duties beneath it were quietly sold for parts. Then my mother got sick. I was 22 and in my last year at university in Krakow when she fainted in a supermarket. At first the doctors thought it was stress, then anemia, then after more tests, more waiting rooms, more dread than any body should have to carry, it became ovarian cancer. I hate writing that sentence even now. It still feels like signing off on something I never agreed to. Everything narrowed after that: chemotherapy schedules, medications, hospital corridors with vending machine coffee and people pretending not to stare at each other's fear. I moved back to Wrocław for a year. My Aunt Clara drove us to appointments when I couldn't. Grandmother Danuta prayed so fiercely I think she expected God to apologize personally if it didn't work. My father cried when I told him. He came to the hospital with flowers. He stood by my mother's bed looking older than I had ever seen him. She was pale, exhausted, and still somehow kinder than either of us deserved. She thanked him for the flowers. He said he was sorry. She closed her eyes and said, "I know," in a tone so empty that even now I think about it when people talk about forgiveness like it's noble. Sometimes it is just fatigue. For a few months, I thought illness might strip everyone down to their essential humanity. My father visited twice. He called more often. He transferred money without being asked. Sabine even sent soup once. I remember feeling ashamed for resenting it. Cancer makes you grateful for gestures you would have rejected in ordinary life. But even then, the old pattern remained. My father's help always arrived with a need for emotional cleanup. If he visited, I was expected to thank Sabine for understanding his absence at home. If he sent money, he would later mention how stressed he and Sabine had been. If he called during treatment, the conversation somehow drifted to how difficult it was for him to see Marta like that. He could not do a decent thing without requiring the room to acknowledge the emotional cost to him. My mother died in November. There are details from that week I will never forget and others I will never be able to arrange in the right order. The smell of hospital sanitizer. The blue cardigan my aunt wore 3 days in a row. The way rain kept tapping the window in tiny patient sounds as if time itself were trying not to disturb us. I was holding my mother's hand when her breathing changed. Clara was on the other side of the bed. I remember whispering, "I'm here," though I don't know whether I was saying it for her or for myself. Death is obscene in how administrative it becomes almost immediately. Papers, calls, funeral home, cemetery plot, priest, flowers, costs, decisions. You are not allowed to fall apart properly because bureaucracy lines up at the door before grief has even put on shoes. My father offered to help with the funeral arrangements. I said yes because I was too tired to say no. That was my mistake. Sabine inserted herself within 24 hours. Not loudly, never loudly. That was her gift. She moved through tragedy like perfume through a room, soft but impossible not to breathe. She suggested a more modern, floral arrangement because my mother wasn't old-fashioned. She recommended a caterer for the wake. She asked whether the black dress I had chosen was perhaps too severe. Then, on the second day, she stood in my mother's flat and asked me what I planned to do with the contents of the wardrobe because it may be healing not to keep everything. I can still see the wardrobe behind her. White doors, one hinge slightly loose, my mother's scarves hanging inside, still carrying her smell. I think something in me cracked so sharply that even Sabine heard it, because she actually stepped back. I told her to get out. My father arrived 10 minutes later because she had called him in tears. He found me shaking in the kitchen, Clara furious in the hallway, and Sabine in the stairwell performing wounded dignity like she had trained professionally. Do you know what he said? She was only trying to help. Not, Amelia, are you all right? Not, Sabine, what on earth possessed you? Not, this is not the time. Just that. She was only trying to help. I told him if helping felt like theft, maybe he should reconsider the word. He said grief was making me lash out. Maybe it was. Grief is not pretty, but I am still convinced some truths can only get past our teeth when grief strips away the training that keeps us polite. He and I did not speak properly for months after the funeral. He married Sabine the following spring in a civil ceremony outside Legnica. I attended because my grandmother begged me not to deepen the family rift and because I was still foolish enough to think absence would somehow make me the villain in a way I could not later correct. I wore navy blue and kept my expression neutral. Sabine wore ivory and looked radiant in the victorious way some people do when they have spent years calling something complicated and it finally becomes official. My father hugged me for the photographer and whispered, "Thank you for being here." As if my presence were a gift to him. At the reception, Sabine's sister Anita asked me whether I might one day call Sabine, bonus family. I remember staring at my wine glass and thinking that language has become too inventive in service of avoiding plain facts. After that I reduced contact to birthdays, Christmas, and the occasional Sunday lunch when guilt or hope got the better of me. Those years are blurry in the way unhappy peace often is. Nothing dramatic enough to justify a total break, nothing healthy enough to call a relationship. My father kept texting me cheerful updates as if we were normal. Photos from trips to Vienna, a new coffee machine, Sabine learning to make Cernik, though she always made it dry. Invitations signed from both of them, as if unity itself were persuasive. Every time I tried to explain why I still kept my distance, my father looked genuinely bewildered. That may have been the most painful part. He did not think of himself as a man who had chosen a new life over his daughter. He thought of himself as a good man unfairly forced to manage difficult women. We had the same fight in different clothes for years. He would say Sabine had made mistakes, but I had to admit I was not easy either. I would say I was a teenager whose parents' marriage collapsed because of his affair, then a daughter watching her mother die while his wife tried to curate the aftermath. He would say I always used the past as a weapon. I would ask why the past only counted when it wounded me, never when it excused him. He hated that question. Then came the house. My mother had not left much when she died. A modest savings account, some jewelry of mostly sentimental value, books, teaching notes, her amber earrings from Gdańsk. The flat itself had been rented, so there was no dramatic inheritance battle, no legal thriller, no will that upended hidden fortunes. What she really left me was memory in object form. Her recipe notebook with oil stains on the corners, her fountain pen, her wool coat, 2 boxes of letters from before I was born, and, most importantly for this story, a cedar chest she had inherited from her own mother. It was heavy, scratched, and not especially valuable to anyone except us. Inside it were photo albums, documents, and a few keepsakes from my childhood that she had saved without telling me. After her death, I could not fit everything into my tiny flat in Krakow, then later my place in Poznan when I moved for work. So my father offered to store the cedar chest in his attic, for as long as needed. I did not want to accept, but Clara said I was being stubborn. Tomas had space. It would be fine. I locked the chest and kept the key. For almost 4 years it remained there. Then last autumn my father had a minor heart scare. Nothing catastrophic, thank God, but enough to terrify him. He called me from the hospital sounding suddenly mortal. I went. Of course I went. No matter how much people hurt you, certain instincts are stitched too deep. Sabine was pale and fluttering and, for once, not particularly composed. I helped with paperwork. I sat by his bed. I spoke to doctors. I bought him slippers because he hated the hospital ones. For 3 weeks, I was the daughter everyone always wanted me to be. My father cried again. He said life was too short for distance. He said he knew he had failed me in many ways. He did not name those ways, but even that partial acknowledgement felt like a rope thrown to someone drowning. I took it. Over the next few months, I began visiting more. Not because Sabine had changed, but because my father seemed softer, humbled. He asked about my work without checking his phone. He apologized for missing a conference presentation of mine years earlier. He even drove with me to the cemetery and stood quietly at my mother's grave without making the moment about himself. I remember driving home afterward thinking maybe this was it. Maybe this was the dull, imperfect, middle-aged version of repair people always talk about. I should have known better than to trust progress that depended on everyone else staying comfortable. In January, Sabine decided they needed to renovate the attic. I found out because she texted me, not my father. Her message was absurdly cheerful. Hi Amelia. We are finally making the upper floor usable this winter. There are a few old items up there, including the chest. Perhaps a good moment for you to sort what you still want and what can be discarded. Warmly, Sabine. Discarded. I felt the blood leave my face so fast I had to sit down. I replied immediately and told her very clearly that nothing in the chest was to be opened, moved, donated, or touched until I came the following weekend. She answered with a thumbs up emoji. I hate that emoji now with a level of passion that is probably unreasonable. I drove to Wrocław on Saturday morning. The chest was open. Not only open, emptied halfway, albums stacked on the floor, papers removed from folders, my mother's letters untied, a bag for rubbish sitting nearby with old receipts, envelopes, and some of her handwritten lesson plans inside. Sabine was in work clothes, hair wrapped in a scarf. Holding a dust rag like this was all perfectly practical. My father was downstairs making coffee. For a second I could not breathe. I asked her what she had done. She said, "Please lower your voice, we are only organizing." I remember that sentence with unusual clarity because it felt so insane. Organizing. As if my mother's life were a drawer of tangled cables. I asked whether she had opened the chest. She said yes, because they needed to know what was worth keeping. She said some papers were already damaged by dust and it made sense to separate important documents from emotional clutter. Emotional clutter. She actually said that. I asked where my father was. She said downstairs, and then, in that maddeningly even tone, "Amelia, you cannot preserve every relic forever." That word again. I went downstairs so fast I nearly slipped. My father was in the kitchen stirring sugar into coffee like the morning were ordinary. When he looked up and saw my face, he knew immediately. I saw it in the way his shoulders sagged before I even spoke. "Did you let her open it?" He started with, "Listen." I said it louder. "Did you let her open my mother's chest?" He put the spoon down and said Sabine was only trying to help them make space. He said they had not thrown away anything important. He said he meant to call me. He said I was overreacting because it was just a chest full of old papers and photographs that would have eventually needed sorting anyway. Just a chest. I think something feral rose in me then. Not theatrical anger. Not the kind that throws dishes. Something colder. The anger that comes when a person realizes they have spent years presenting evidence to someone who has already decided it does not count. I asked him if he understood that those were my mother's letters. My mother's handwriting. My childhood. The only things she touched that still existed in any real way. He said of course he understood, but there should be a study of how many terrible things begin with of course, but. Sabine came downstairs and inserted herself beside him. She said no one was disrespecting Marta. She said she knew this was sensitive for me. She said the house belonged to both her and my father now, and practical decisions had to be made jointly. And then, because cruelty often wears the mask of reason, she added, at some point, "Amelia, grief becomes identity, and that is not healthy." That was the moment. It wasn't only the sentence. It was my father standing there while she said it. It was the look on his face, not shocked, not angry on my behalf, just tired. Tired because I was making the scene messy. Tired because he wanted peace and I, once again, was refusing to provide it. I saw, all at once, every year of it. My room turned into storage. My mother called a relic. The wardrobe, the funeral, the wedding, the endless requests for maturity. The constant demand that I swallow hurt so he could call the family functional. So I asked him, not gently, not beautifully, but clearly. I said, then answer me now, because I am done having the same fight for 10 years. If staying married to Sabine means losing me, are you choosing her? Because that is what has been happening over and over, and I am tired of pretending it's misunderstanding. If you want her version of peace, then say it now and I will stop coming here. I will stop trying, but you do not get to keep asking me to be your daughter while you stand beside a woman who goes through my mother's life like it's a bin bag. The whole kitchen went silent. It is strange how quiet a room can become when somebody finally says the sentence everyone has been training them not to say. My father stared at me as if I had slapped him. Sabine's face went white, then red. She started to speak, but I looked at him, only him, because that was the point. I had argued with the wrong person for years. Sabine was opportunistic, vain, controlling, yes. But she was also exactly who she had always been. The greater betrayal belonged to the man who kept watching and calling it compromise. I said, I'm not asking who you love more. I'm asking whether I matter enough for you to draw one line. One. Just one. Tell her to leave my mother's things alone. Tell her she does not get to decide what is clutter. Tell her she does not get to talk about grief like it's a character flaw. If you can't do that, then choose properly and stop pretending you're neutral. He said my name the way parents do when they want tone to replace substance. Amelia? I said, no, not this time. He looked at Sabine, then at me, then down at the table. And that was my answer. Maybe if he had shouted, I could have hated him cleanly. Maybe if he had said, yes, I choose my wife, at least the wound would have had shape. But he did what he had always done. He tried to dissolve reality with language. He said, you are making me choose in a way that is cruel and unfair. Cruel and unfair. I laughed. I actually laughed. It sounded awful, even to me. I told him life had already made the choice years ago. I was simply asking him to say it out loud. He said families were more complicated than ultimatums. He said Sabine was his wife and I was his daughter, and he refused to participate in this kind of emotional blackmail. Sabine, finding her footing again, said she would not remain where she was spoken to abusively in her own home. Her own home. The words landed like dirt on a coffin. I went upstairs, repacked everything I could with shaking hands, and carried it to my car in 4 trips. Albums, letters, scarves, lesson plans, the amber earrings, the fountain pen, even the stupid ceramic mug Sabine had once called a relic. My father followed me outside on the 2nd trip and said I was destroying the possibility of reconciliation. I asked him whether reconciliation required me to present my dead mother for review every few years until Sabine approved what remained. He said I twisted everything. I said maybe things that ugly only sounded twisted when spoken plainly. When I loaded the last box, he put his hand on the car door and said, almost pleading, Amelia, don't do this. That nearly broke me, because some stupid part of me still wanted him to mean something different. To finally say, I'm sorry. To finally say, I should have protected you. To finally say, I was wrong. Instead, he just looked afraid of consequences, not grief-stricken by what had caused them. So I said, I'm not doing this. I'm stopping. And I drove away. For the first hour on the motorway I was so angry I felt electrified. Then, like all hot things, it cooled into something heavier. I had to pull over near Opal because I suddenly couldn't stop crying. Not elegant tears, the humiliating kind that leave your face swollen and your chest aching. I cried because I had done it. I cried because I had not done it sooner. I cried because even after everything, some childish corner of me had still believed there was a sentence capable of waking my father into fatherhood. There wasn't. The family fallout came immediately. Grandmother Danuta said she understood my pain but begged me to apologize for the form of what I'd said. Aunt Clara, who had hated Sabine from day one, told me it was about time someone forced Tomas to hear himself. My cousin Peter said making a parent choose never ends well. Anita sent me a message so polished it might as well have been translated by a public relations firm, saying Sabine had only wanted to help create a healthier environment and was deeply wounded by my hostility. My father sent 3 messages in the first week. The first said he loved me and hoped I would calm down. The second said I had gravely insulted his wife and owed both of them an apology. The third said he would always be there when I was ready to behave like family again. I stared at that last one for a long time. Behave like family. What a sentence. It said everything. In his mind, family was not the people who protected you. Family was the people who endured injury quietly enough to preserve the appearance of unity. I have not answered him. It has been 4 months. Sometimes I feel certain I did the only sane thing left. Sometimes I lie awake and hear my own voice in that kitchen and wonder whether I crossed a line from truth into cruelty. There is a difference between setting a boundary and placing a knife on the table. I know that. I just no longer know what people expect from daughters whose boundaries have been treated like decorative suggestions for years. The worst part is that I do miss him. Not the man he has actually been, perhaps, but the father I keep finding in old memories like loose coins in winter coats. Him teaching me to ride a bicycle near Shitniki Park. Him carrying me home asleep after a wedding. Him standing in the school corridor with flowers after my final exams. It is possible to miss someone and still no contact with them turns you into a smaller version of yourself. I wish more people admitted that. I also know what some people would say if they heard only the shortest version of this story. They would say no spouse should be forced into a contest with a child. They would say marriage requires loyalty. They would say adults are entitled to new lives. All true, maybe, but I was not asking my father to leave his wife because she annoyed me or because I never accepted the divorce. I was asking whether, after years of erasure, humiliation, and cowardice, he was willing to protect me once. Not forever, not completely, once, and when the moment came, he protected the comfort of the woman who helped break my family and then spent a decade redecorating the grave. So yes, I asked the question no one likes hearing. Me or her? Not because I thought I would win. Because I finally understood I had already lost, and I was tired of being the last person in the room pretending otherwise. Story 3. An anonymous person messaged me saying my boyfriend was arrested, and by the end of that night I realized I had been sleeping next to a man I didn't actually know at all. I'm writing this in the style of someone asking for advice because that's exactly what this would have been if I had posted it in the middle of everything happening, but the truth is that when it started, I didn't even know what kind of advice I needed. I didn't know whether I was dealing with a cruel prank, an ex trying to destroy my relationship, some administrative mix-up, or the first crack in a life I had been treating as stable because it was easier than examining it closely. I'm 27, and until this happened I lived in Antwerp with my boyfriend, Adrian, who was 29. We had been together 3 years, and we were at that stage where other people had started asking us the questions that sound casual but aren't. When are you moving somewhere bigger? Are you getting engaged? Have you talked about children? Whose family would you spend Christmas with if you ever left Belgium, and all the rest of it? The questions that assume continuity. The questions that quietly tell you everyone around you has accepted your relationship as part of the architecture of your future. If someone had asked me the week before all this whether I trusted him, I would have said yes without hesitation. Not in a naive, dramatic, movie way. Just in the ordinary adult way trust exists when bills are split, groceries are bought, keys are exchanged, and you no longer brace yourself before seeing someone's name on your phone. I knew his coffee order, the old scar near his elbow from falling off a bicycle when he was 11, the exact expression he made when he was trying not to laugh in serious situations, the way he always claimed he didn't like sweet things and then stole bites of my desserts anyway. He knew that I can't sleep if a kitchen cabinet is left open, that I call my older sister when I'm overwhelmed even if I don't plan to tell her anything, that I hate receiving voice notes longer than 30 seconds, and that I have a weird habit of folding clean laundry immediately but letting dry laundry sit on the rack for 2 full days like it's being punished. That was our life. Small habits, shared shelves, mutual routines. Nothing dramatic, which is why what happened felt less like a bomb and more like the floorboards of my life separating all at once under my feet. It started on a Wednesday evening in late November, just after 6. It was raining. The kind of cold Belgian rain that doesn't fall so much as attach itself to the air and make everything look permanently disappointed. I had just left work. I'm a project coordinator for an events company, which sounds glamorous only to people who have never chased suppliers for invoices while standing next to stacks of rented chairs. My day had been annoying in the normal way. A florist had delivered to the wrong venue, One of our clients suddenly wanted more atmosphere without changing the budget, and I had spent 20 minutes trying to locate a missing shipment of printed menus that turned out to be in a driver's van somewhere near Mechelen. I was waiting at a tram stop, balancing an umbrella badly and deciding whether I had the energy to cook or whether I was going to stop for takeaway on the way home, when my phone buzzed with a message request on Instagram. I almost ignored it because I get random message requests every so often, mostly spam, event inquiries that should have gone to my email, or strangers reacting to stories in that way people do when they mistake having internet access for having social permission. But the preview line caught my eye because it didn't say hello or compliment or emoji. It said, "If you're Adrian de Smet's girlfriend, do not go home alone tonight. He was arrested 2 hours ago." I read it once, twice, and then a third time as if repetition might turn it into something less insane. The account sending it had no profile picture, no posts, no followers, no following, a throwaway account made 10 days earlier. I remember looking up from my phone at the tram tracks like the city might somehow contain an explanation, as if there might be a sign over a bakery saying this is just a misunderstanding, don't worry. My first thought, stupidly, was that someone had confused my Adrian with another Adrian. De Smet is not exactly a rare surname. My second thought was that it had to be a prank. My third thought, which arrived with a physical feeling that started in my throat and dropped into my stomach, was that the message included my boyfriend's full name. I typed back before I could think better of it. "Who is this?" The typing bubble appeared almost immediately. "I can't tell you that. Just don't warn him if he contacts you. And don't let him come back tonight if he's released." I wrote, "What are you talking about? Arrested for what?" No answer. I sent another. "If this is some kind of joke, it's disgusting." Still nothing. By then the tram had arrived, but I didn't get on. I stepped away from the stop and called Adrian. It rang once and went straight to voicemail. I called again. Same thing. I texted. "Someone just sent me a message saying you were arrested. Please call me right now." No answer. I tried to call again, and this time the call connected for half a second and cut out. I don't know why that unnerved me more than voicemail, but it did. I called my sister Eva next, because when I don't know what category a crisis belongs to, she helps me sort it. Eva is 32, lives in Ghent with her husband Niels, and has the unnerving ability to sound calm even when telling you your life may be on fire. She answered on the second ring and said, "Hey, Lou, what happened?" That's how obvious my voice was. I hadn't even said anything yet. I told her about the message. She went quiet, then asked me to read it word for word. I did. She asked whether I recognized the account. No. Whether Adrian had said anything strange that day. No. Whether he had any reason to be at a police station, in court, in trouble at work, in a fight, driving after drinking, anything. No. Nothing. Absolutely nothing that would make he was arrested fit into the world I understood. Eva said, "Don't go home yet." I said, "You think it's real?" She said, "I think you don't know what's real yet, and until you do, you shouldn't be alone." I laughed then, one short, ugly laugh, because there is something surreal about hearing your sensible older sister speak like a woman in the first 10 minutes of a thriller. "I'm serious," she said. "Go somewhere public, call the police non-emergency line and ask if they can confirm whether he's in custody." That had not even occurred to me, which is embarrassing now, but in my defense, I was still mentally operating in the reality where this was probably nonsense. So I did exactly that. I stood half under an awning outside a pharmacy and called. The woman who answered was polite but flat in the professional way that means she has dealt with hysterical people all day and refuses to become one herself. I explained that I had received an anonymous message claiming my boyfriend, Adrian de Smet, had been arrested, and I needed to know whether this was real because I was concerned for his safety. She asked for his date of birth. I gave it. She asked my relationship to him. I told her. Then she said she could not provide full details over the phone but confirmed that yes, a man with that name and date of birth had been detained earlier that afternoon. I actually stopped breathing for a second. I asked, "Detained for what?" She said she could not discuss the case, and if he wanted me informed, he could authorize that. I asked whether he was hurt. She repeated that she could not disclose more but said if it were a medical emergency, I would likely already have been contacted. Likely. That word doesn't comfort anyone. I thanked her, hung up, and just stood there with my phone in my hand while people passed around me carrying shopping bags and backpacks and wet umbrellas, and it felt deeply offensive that none of them knew that my life had just tilted. I called Eva back. She answered immediately, as if she had been holding the phone. "It's real," I said. She didn't gasp or swear. She just said, "Okay. Come to us." I told her I should go home first. Maybe Adrian would call, maybe there was some explanation, maybe it was a misunderstanding. She said, "Lucia, if he was arrested and you don't know why, you do not go sit alone in that flat waiting for him." Hearing it phrased that clearly should have settled the matter, but I was still caught in this desperate urge to preserve the normal version of events. The longer I avoided going home, the more room there was for this to remain abstract. Some stupid detached administrative thing. Some fight outside a bar. Some mix-up with identification. Some bureaucratic absurdity. So of course I went home. I know that was foolish. If this were someone else's story, I would be shouting at her through the screen. But people do not behave intelligently in the first hour of a shock. They behave according to habit, and my habit was going home. The flat was quiet, dark, and exactly as we had left it that morning. His coat wasn't there because he'd been wearing it. My scarf was still hanging crookedly off the chair in the hall. A saucepan from the previous night was drying on the rack because Adrian always insisted, "Air does the rest," and I always said no, towels do the rest, but I had stopped arguing because the pan eventually got dry either way. The normalcy of it made me feel slightly sick. I turned on every light. I called his phone again. Voicemail. I texted. "Police confirmed you were detained. I need to know what happened." Then I sat on the edge of the sofa and stared at the front door like it might open and restore cause and effect. Instead, my phone rang from an unknown number. I answered so fast I almost dropped it. "Hello?" There was a pause, then Adrian's voice, low and tight and nothing like his normal relaxed, amused tone. "Lucia." I stood up so fast my knee hit the coffee table. "Where are you?" "At a station. They're processing things. Listen to me carefully. Those are not words you ever want from your boyfriend unless he is about to explain a hostage negotiation." "What happened?" I asked. "Why were you arrested?" "It's a misunderstanding." "Of course. It is always a misunderstanding in the first version." "What misunderstanding?" "I can't explain properly over the phone." "You can explain the category." "Adrian, were you in a fight? Were you driving? Were you drunk? Did someone accuse you of something? What is happening?" He exhaled sharply, annoyed already, which infuriated me because I had not been the one detained by police. "It's connected to work," he said. He worked in logistics for an import company near the port. Not glamorous, not suspicious, just boxes and schedules and customs paperwork and endless spreadsheets, at least as far as I knew. He had been there almost 4 years. What does connected to work mean? It means I need you to trust me until I can come home and explain. That sentence fell into me with all the grace of a brick. Trust me. There is something uniquely obscene about being told to trust blindly in the exact moment reality has proven you do not have enough information to do that safely. I said, "An anonymous account messaged me before you called. How did someone know you'd been arrested before I did?" Silence. Then, "What anonymous account?" I repeated the message. His voice changed, not panicked, not confused, sharp, focused. "Did you reply?" "Yes." "What did you say?" I couldn't believe he was asking that before anything else. I asked who it was. "Did you tell them I called you? Did you say you were home?" "No." "Adrian, who is it?" Another pause. Then he said, "You need to leave the flat for tonight." That was the moment fear became something cleaner and colder. "What? Just go to Evis or somewhere. I'll explain later." "Explain now." "I can't." "You can." "You won't." "Lucia, please." No elaboration. No reassurance. No, "You're safe." No, "I'm sorry. Just leave." I asked, very slowly, "Am I in danger because of you?" He took too long to answer. Not because he was deciding whether to lie. Because he was deciding which lie. "I don't think so," he said finally. "I don't think so." I don't know whether there is a more useless sentence in the English language. I grabbed a bag, shoved in clothes, my laptop, my passport, my charger, toiletries, and the folder where I keep all the life admin things I'm always afraid of losing. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped a bottle of face cream and it rolled under the bathroom sink. While I was packing, Adrian kept talking in bursts, as if trying to sound practical would erase the fact that he was speaking from a police station and refusing to tell me why. He told me not to answer unknown calls. He told me if anyone came to the flat asking for him, I should say I didn't know where he was. He told me not to mention his arrest to neighbors. That last part made me stop. I said, "You are telling me to lie." He said, "I'm telling you not to involve yourself until you know everything." That is lying. He snapped then, just slightly. Lucia, not everything is as dramatic as you're making it. I remember standing there with one boot on and one boot off, looking at my own reflection in the hall mirror and thinking, I am literally taking instructions from a detained man who won't tell me why he was detained, and I'm the dramatic one? I said, "I'm leaving now." He lowered his voice again. "Please don't talk to anyone." And there it was, the sentence that would replay in my head later as the first undeniable sign that he was not protecting me. He was protecting himself. I hung up. The taxi to Ghent felt unreal. Everything outside was blurred by rain and streetlight and the kind of exhausted disbelief that makes your body feel both heavy and buzzy at the same time. Eva buzzed me into the building before I even rang. She was still in work clothes, barefoot, hair pinned up badly like she had redone it 3 times and given up. Niels was in the kitchen making tea, not because tea solves anything but because he is the sort of man who responds to chaos by boiling water and locating blankets. I barely got 3 sentences into the story before Eva said, "Sit down. Start from the message." So I did. Every detail. The account, the police call, Adrian's phone call, the way he had asked what I'd told the anonymous person, the way he had told me to leave the flat without explaining why, the way he had told me not to talk to anyone. Niels listened without interrupting until I repeated that Adrian said it was connected to work. Then he asked, "Did he sound scared for you or scared for himself?" I said, "Both." But even then I knew the answer wasn't both. Not equally. Eva asked whether Adrian had ever given me reason to doubt him before. I said no automatically, because that is the answer you give when you haven't yet started resorting the past. But once she asked a second time, more gently, I had to admit there were things. Not dramatic things, just those tiny unfinished edges in a person's story that you smooth over because you love them and because adulthood is full of minor inconsistencies anyway. He was private about work, not secretive in a way I had found alarming, just oddly unwilling to talk specifics. If I asked how his day was, he answered in broad strokes. Busy, annoying, customs delays, idiots in management, supplier nonsense. He never brought colleagues around. In 3 years I had met exactly one coworker, briefly, at a summer barbecue, and even then Adrian seemed slightly tense the whole time, as if waiting for the man to say the wrong thing. I had asked once why he never invited anyone from work for drinks, and he said he preferred keeping parts of his life separate. He had another phone for about 5 months last year, which he said was a temporary work phone. When I asked why he never answered it in front of me, he laughed and said because if I heard the nonsense his supervisor talked, I'd ban him from having a job. At the time it felt plausible. Sometimes he would take late walks alone after dinner. Not often enough to seem suspicious, just enough that I can now remember them. 20 minutes, 40, once almost an hour. If I asked where he went, he said he needed air. About 6 months before his arrest, we had been in Bruges for a weekend when he got a call, looked at the screen, and went pale for a second before stepping out of the hotel room to answer it. When he came back, he told me it was a debt issue involving his younger brother. I believed him because his brother, Jonas, had always been a complicated presence in the stories Adrian told. Never there in person, just a sort of roaming disaster in the background. Lost jobs, unpaid bills, arguments, a motorbike he shouldn't have bought. I had met Jonas only once at Christmas and he had seemed charming in a thin, restless way that made me instinctively count my wallet afterward. These are the details that mean nothing until they mean everything. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, my brain started offering me new possible explanations, each one worse than the last. Maybe he had hit someone. Maybe there had been fraud at work. Maybe the anonymous message came from a woman. Maybe drugs. Maybe theft. Maybe some stupid fight that looked worse than it was. Maybe. Fear is exhausting not because it screams, but because it generates. At 3 in the morning I checked my message request again. Nothing new. I clicked the empty anonymous profile and saw that it had now been deleted. Deleted. That should not have mattered because the message was still in my inbox, but it made the whole thing feel even more staged, more deliberate. At 8 the next morning, Adrian called again. He sounded tired but composed, which somehow made me angrier. As if he had gotten a few hours to gather his story while I had spent the night mentally setting every part of our life on fire and trying to decide which smoke looked most plausible. He told me he had been released pending investigation. Released pending investigation. That phrase is not something you accidentally say if the police simply had to clarify a parking ticket. I asked where he was. He said at a cafe near the station. I asked whether he was coming to Evis to explain everything in person. He hesitated just long enough for me to know he didn't want witnesses. Then he said, "Can we meet alone?" "No, Lucia, no, not after last night." He sounded offended. Offended. I could have screamed. "I need to know what happened," I said. "And I am not doing this in private so you can tell me half of it and watch my face." That landed. He knew me well enough to know I meant it. So 3 hours later we met in Eva and Niels's kitchen with all 4 mugs on the table untouched because nobody was actually going to drink anything. He looked awful. Same coat, same gray jumper from the day before, stubble darker than usual, eyes bloodshot, hair flattened on one side like he had slept against a wall. For a split second I felt a surge of automatic pity, the kind that comes from seeing someone you love look broken. Then I remembered he had let me spend the night in terror without enough information to protect myself, and the pity curdled. He looked at Eva and Niels and said, "Do they need to be here?" Eva said, "Yes." That was that. Adrian sat down and folded his hands the way people do when they want to look controlled. Then he told us that there had been an issue at work involving shipments, customs declarations, and inventory discrepancies. I said, "Use nouns that normal people understand." He looked at me, tired and irritated. "I'm trying." "No," I said, "you are minimizing." Niels leaned back in his chair and said, almost pleasantly, "Try the version you'd use if someone had spent the night wondering whether criminals were coming to her flat." That was the first useful thing anyone had said to him, because it forced him out of corporate fog. So he said it more plainly. Goods had been moved through the company using false documentation. Not by him alone, he stressed that immediately, but he admitted he had signed off on paperwork connected to shipments that were being investigated. He said he had suspected something was wrong months ago but convinced himself it was just the usual gray zone nonsense companies near ports sometimes do to speed things up. He said he only realized the scale recently. He said he had tried to distance himself. He said he hadn't told me because he didn't want to drag me into work chaos that might turn out to be nothing. Every sentence had that self-exculpatory shape. Not a lie exactly, but arranged. I asked, "What kind of goods?" He said he didn't know for sure. I said, "That's impossible." He said, "I knew categories, not details." "Which categories?" Another pause. "Electronics, luxury accessories, some pharmaceuticals." The room went still. Even I knew enough to understand that, "some pharmaceuticals," is the kind of phrase you use when the real word is uglier. Eva asked, "Counterfeit?" He rubbed his face. "Some of it, probably." Probably. There was that word again, doing all the work cowardice couldn't. I asked whether this was why he told me to leave the flat. He said maybe people involved wouldn't be happy that the police had picked him up. Niels said, "People involved meaning your employers are criminals?" Adrian said, "I don't know. I believed that part, unfortunately. Not because it comforted me, but because uncertainty looked real on him for the first time. Not staged, not managed, real fear." Then I asked the question that had been sitting behind every other question. "Who messaged me?" And he actually went pale. Not confused pale, recognizing pale. He said he didn't know. I said, "That's a lie." He said he genuinely didn't know for certain. I asked who might have. He looked at the table a long time and then said, "Possibly someone named Marius." I had never heard that name in my life. Who was Marius? A coworker? A supervisor? A friend? Adrian said Marius had done side facilitation for certain shipments. Again with the nouns slipping around the truth. Niels said, "Do you mean he arranged illegal movement of goods?" Adrian snapped, "Yes, fine, if that's how you want to say it." Eva said, "It's how the law says it." That shut him up. The story, once it started coming, came in fragments. Over the last year, Adrian had been increasingly involved in paperwork that did not match actual cargo values and descriptions. He insisted he never handled money directly and never physically moved anything himself. He said he had told himself it was tax evasion at worst. Then there were rumors about a larger network, and he got scared. He had wanted out. He had tried to distance himself. He had been questioned once informally weeks earlier and not told me. Then yesterday police detained several people from the company at once. I asked, so this was not a misunderstanding. He stared at me. Was it? I said. Finally, quietly, he said, not entirely. Not entirely. The language people use when confessing is fascinating. They often think that if they avoid fully naming a thing, they are not fully admitting it. As if precision itself is a punishment. Then came the part that made everything even worse. The anonymous message had not just said he was arrested. It had told me not to go home alone and not to let him back if he was released. Which meant whoever sent it did not merely want to inform me. They wanted to warn me against him. So I asked the obvious question. Is there any reason someone would think I need protection from you? He looked offended again, which was not the reaction of a man wrongly accused. It was the reaction of a man irritated that the question existed. He said, no, too quickly. Eva heard it too. Think carefully before you answer. His jaw tightened. I have never hurt Lucia. That is not the same as no. I asked whether he had given my name to anyone involved in this. He said no. I asked whether anyone knew where we lived. He said probably some people at work. I asked whether anyone had ever been to the flat. He said only one colleague once to pick up a set of documents when Adrian forgot them at home. One colleague once. A man I had never met. In our flat. My flat too, technically, though suddenly it felt like a stage set built around my ignorance. Then another question came to me. One that should have come earlier. Why didn't the police search the flat? He looked away. They might still. That was enough. Eva actually let out a sound under her breath that was half laugh, half prayer for patience. Niels sat up straighter. I said, are there things in that flat that could get me in trouble? He said, I don't think so. I stood up so fast my chair hit the floor behind me. I am so tired of hearing what you think. Are there or are there not things in my home that could implicate me in whatever this is? He stood too, hands up. Lucia, calm down. It is a testament to my upbringing that I did not throw a mug at him. Eva told him to answer the question. He said there were some documents in the wardrobe and possibly a USB drive in his desk drawer that might be relevant to the investigation. He said he had not known what else to do with them. He said he never meant to put me at risk. Never meant to. Intent is such a pathetic refuge. I asked whether he had ever used my name, my address, my bank details, anything of mine, in connection with any of this. He swore no, swore it, repeated it, looked me directly in the eye and swore. And because the morning had not yet humiliated me enough, that was the exact moment his phone lit up on the table. A message preview. Jonas. Did you tell Lucia about the account in her name? No one said anything for maybe 3 full seconds. Adrian grabbed for the phone, but Niels, who is normally so mild that people mistake him for passive, put his hand over it first. Absolutely not, he said. Adrian stood there with the expression of a man watching the last safe bridge collapse behind him. I felt something inside me turn so completely that I almost didn't recognize my own voice when I spoke. What account? He said, it's not what you think. There should be an international alarm that goes off every time a man says that. Just a siren and flashing lights so women can evacuate. I said it again. What account? He looked at me, then at Eva, then at Niels, and I watched him make the calculation every liar makes when the small lie has become structurally unable to hold up the bigger lie. He could either confess partially or wait for discovery and lose whatever control he had left. He chose partial. Months earlier, he had used a digital account registered with some of my information for temporary transfers. He said he intended to close it. He said it had never held much. He said it was just to move funds quickly while he sorted out work issues. He said Jonas had helped set it up because Adrian didn't want his name directly attached to something that might later look irregular. There are moments where rage is so pure it becomes almost clarifying. I didn't cry. I didn't shout immediately. I just looked at him and understood, with a level of precision I almost wish I could unlearn, that the man I had lived with had not merely lied to me. He had used me, not in a poetic emotional way, in an administrative, documentable, prosecutable way. I asked, You opened an account in my name? He said, not fully in your name. Eva said, do not play with wording. He started talking faster then, trying to regain ground. Some of my details, not all. It was temporary. He planned to tell me once he solved it. Nothing serious went through it. Jonas exaggerated. He had panicked. He was trying to protect us. He never wanted me dragged in. Every sentence made it worse. I asked if he had forged my signature. Silence. I asked again. A tiny nod. That was it. There are things that end a relationship, and then there are things that reveal the relationship had already ended before you knew it. This was the second kind. The love didn't evaporate in that instant. That would have been easier. But whatever structure had been holding it up collapsed so completely that love became irrelevant, like caring about curtains in a house whose foundation has split. I told him to leave. He said he was trying to be honest now. I said, you do not get credit for honesty after I catch the lie sitting on your screen. He said he loved me. I said, that sentence has become unusable from you. He tried to touch my arm. I stepped back so hard I hit the counter. Niels walked around the table and physically positioned himself between us, not aggressively, just decisively, which is somehow more humiliating for the man being blocked. Adrian looked at all of us and saw, I think, for the first time, that there was no version of this where he could talk me back into the relationship by sounding wounded. So he left. And then the real nightmare started, because until that point, emotionally speaking, I had still been inside the drama of the relationship. After he left, it became a practical matter too. Legal, financial, administrative, dangerous in ways paperwork makes dangerous, which is often worse than a screaming fight because forms last longer than apologies. Eva took over in the way only older sisters can. She called a lawyer recommended by a friend. She told me not to go back to the flat without legal advice and, if possible, police accompaniment. She told me to freeze everything I could think of. Bank accounts, credit checks, passwords, email, digital ID, anything Adrian might know or have touched. Niels called in sick to work that afternoon and drove me back to Antwerp so we could gather evidence of what was in the flat without removing anything that might later matter. I felt sick the entire drive. At the flat, nothing looked different, which was somehow the worst part. The blanket still folded on the sofa. The olive oil bottle by the cooker. His running shoes by the radiator. The framed print we bought at a market in Lille. A life that still looked like a life, except now every object seemed capable of being part of a crime scene. We started with photographs. Every room, every drawer we opened, the desk, the wardrobe, the hallway cabinet, the spare room. Niels insisted on documenting everything before I touched it. I thought he was overreacting until I found the envelope taped under the lowest shelf in Adrian's wardrobe. Not a film-style thick brown envelope stuffed with obvious villain papers. Just a white office envelope with no writing on it, tucked so flat against the underside of the shelf that I would never have noticed it unless I had bent to pick up a sock. Inside were photocopies of my passport, my national ID card, 2 utility bills, and what looked like a printout of an online verification form with my name and a signature that approximated mine if you had only ever seen it from across a room. I sat down on the floor and genuinely thought I might vomit. There is betrayal, and then there is discovering someone needed copies of your identity documents hidden in your shared home. Niels took the papers out of my hands and put them back in the envelope without saying anything. Then he photographed the exact location where I found it, the contents, and the time on his phone. In the desk drawer we found the USB drive Adrian mentioned. Neither of us touched it beyond photographing it in place. There were also 3 notebooks, one of which contained columns of numbers and initials I did not recognize, dates, amounts, container references, and beside some entries a letter M I assumed Marius. Maybe I was wrong, maybe I wasn't. At that point my life had become a series of maybe not, maybe yes, probably, and dear God. Then came something else I still have trouble thinking about calmly. In a shoebox in the spare room wardrobe, under old cables and a camera Adrian hadn't used in years, there was cash. Not mountains of it, not enough for dramatic television, but enough that no reasonable person forgets it's there. Several thick bundles in mixed notes, held with ordinary rubber bands. Niels just looked at me. I said, I have never seen that before. He said, I know. That nearly made me cry more than anything else that day. Just being believed immediately. We called the lawyer from the flat. He told us not to remove suspicious documents or money, not to confront Adrian further, and to contact the police to state clearly that I had discovered material I believed might be relevant and that I did not consent to any use of my identity in financial activity. He was very specific about language. Do not speculate. Do not try to narrate the whole situation emotionally. State facts. Document dates. Preserve messages. Protect yourself first. Protect yourself first. I wish someone taught women that sentence at school. The police came that evening. 2 officers, tired and matter of fact. I gave a statement. I handed over screenshots of the anonymous message, Adrian's texts, and a summary of what he had admitted. They took the envelope with my documents, the notebooks, the USB drive, and eventually the cash. One officer asked whether Adrian had been violent with me. I said no, not physically. Then he asked if Adrian had ever coerced me into signing anything or controlled my access to finances. Also no. Then, after a pause, he asked whether Adrian ever isolated me or discouraged me from speaking to others. That answer was harder. Not directly, I said. But afterward, while they catalogued the evidence at my dining table, I remembered things I had filed away as personality quirks. Adrian's dislike of me discussing our finances with Eva because family doesn't need to know everything. His irritation when I casually mentioned work annoyances to friends because he thought people overshared too much. The way he once got cold when I joked to a colleague that Adrian treated passwords like state secrets. The way he always offered to handle admin tasks we shared. The way he'd say, almost proudly, that I was lucky to have someone who understood complicated paperwork. Complicated paperwork. If I had €1 for every warning sign disguised as competence, I could have paid my legal fees in cash. The anonymous messenger remained the strangest part for days. I could not stop thinking about them. Why warn me? Why anonymously? Why before Adrian called? Did they feel guilty? Were they trying to hurt him? Were they trying to help me? Did they know what he'd done with my identity? Did they know worse? Were they watching him, me, both of us? 3 days later I got a second message, this time by email, from an address that looked auto-generated. It said only, check whether he ever asked to photograph your documents, for travel, or for tenancy forms. Ask police about secondary verification attempts. He used women he lived with because shared addresses passed checks. I'm sorry. No name, no signature, no reply possible because the address bounced when Eva tried. Used women he lived with. Plural. I had to sit on the kitchen floor after reading that because my legs went weak in a way that felt theatrical until I realized theater has nothing on the body's response to pattern recognition. Plural. I had not been one terrible mistake. I had been one iteration. The police wouldn't tell me much, but when I forwarded the email, the officer handling my statement called and asked me several more questions. Had Adrian ever lived with someone before me? Yes, one long-term ex named Sophie, according to him. Had I ever met her? No. Had Adrian ever asked to scan my documents? Yes, actually, last spring, before our trip to Croatia, he said it would be easier to keep copies together in case anything got lost abroad. Had I consented to him storing those copies? Yes. Did I know where they were stored? I thought so. A folder on our shared laptop. The officer asked whether Adrian ever had access to physical copies too. I said probably, since some arrived by post and he sometimes collected mail. I felt physically dirty after that call, as if trust were a substance he had been touching with contaminated hands for years. I found Sophie online after 2 days of indecision. That was not something the police told me to do, and maybe it was foolish, but I needed to know whether I was crazy for thinking this might have happened before. Her account was private, but her surname was still on an old tagged photo from years ago. I found her on LinkedIn, then Facebook, then, eventually, an email address on the site for the dental clinic where she worked in Leuven. I wrote and deleted 4 versions before sending one that was blunt but not insane. I said my name was Lucia. I had been Adrian's partner for 3 years. I was sorry to contact her, but something serious had happened involving possible financial misuse of my identity, and I needed to know whether Adrian had ever used her documents or opened anything in her name without her knowledge. I said she did not have to reply if she was uncomfortable. She replied the next morning. One line first. I've been wondering when something like this would happen again. Then she asked if we could speak by phone. I went cold reading it. We spoke that evening. Her voice was flat in the way voices go flat when they're crossing territory they have walked before and hate. Adrian had not, as far as she knew, opened full accounts in her name. But after their breakup, she discovered missed payments linked to a broadband contract at an address she had never lived at, set up using copies of her ID and an old utility bill. When she confronted him, he told her it was an error from a housing arrangement with a friend. She nearly reported him but didn't because by then they had already separated. She was exhausted, and he begged her not to ruin his life over one panicked decision. She believed, or wanted to believe, that it was isolated. Then she said something that turned my blood to ice. He always picked women who were organized, she said. Women whose documents were easy to locate because they actually kept their lives in order. He liked dating responsible people because it made them easy to borrow legitimacy from. I don't think I spoke for several seconds after that. She apologized. I said she had nothing to apologize for. She said she should have reported him properly years earlier. I said maybe if she had, he'd have simply chosen someone else sooner. Which was true and not true and uselessly philosophical all at once. After that call I cried harder than I had since the arrest. Not because I had learned something entirely new, but because it ended the fantasy that whatever Adrian had done to me had emerged from panic and stress and terrible recent choices. No, it belonged to him more deeply than that. Maybe not in exactly the same form every time. Maybe he escalated, maybe circumstances changed, but there was a line there, running backward through years, and I had stepped onto it thinking it was a path toward a future. Adrian kept trying to contact me through different channels for about 2 weeks. Unknown numbers, email, a handwritten letter sent to Eva's address after I blocked everything else. The letters were masterpieces of self-pity. He said he had made terrible decisions under pressure. He said he had intended to fix everything before I ever found out. He said Jonas and other people at work had pushed him further than he wanted to go. He said he never stopped loving me. He said the account in my name had barely been used. He said he understood why I was angry but begged me not to join the line of people trying to destroy him. That sentence is when I stopped reading the rest. People like Adrian love passive phrasing when they are cornered. Mistakes were made, pressure mounted, bad decisions happened, situations escalated. At no point does the language naturally produce the simple active structure. I did this. I chose it. I repeated it. I knew you didn't know. He also kept insisting that I should not believe anonymous sources, exes with grudges, or half-briefed police narratives. Which is almost funny, coming from a man whose version of transparency was being arrested first and explaining later. The practical consequences were exhausting. I had to prove my own ignorance over and over. To the bank, to a fraud unit, to a legal advisor, to my landlord when I asked about leaving the lease early because I could not stand the flat anymore. To my employer when my concentration vanished so badly I once sent a catering quote to the wrong wedding couple and only realized because the bride politely asked why her vegan canapes now included prosciutto. I moved out within a month. I didn't even keep most of the furniture because too many pieces suddenly felt contaminated by context. The lamp we bought together. The kitchen table where police bagged evidence. The bed where I had slept beside a man who knew exactly how much of me he was using and still asked me, regularly, if I trusted him. I kept my books, my clothes, my grandmother's earrings, the blue ceramic bowl from a market in Porto, the good knives because I bought them before Adrian existed, and the ugly yellow armchair everyone hated but me. Everything else I let go or left behind. Emotionally, the hardest part wasn't the legal fallout or even the money. It was the embarrassment of memory. Going back through 3 years and seeing moments I had once classified as intimacy now look like access. Times he offered to deal with paperwork. Times he reminded me where my passport was kept. Times he said we should scan things, just in case. Times he asked for my login to download a travel confirmation because I was in the shower. None of those moments had felt predatory when they happened. That's the problem. People always imagine betrayal as something with dramatic music under it. But usually it looks like errands. If you had asked me before this what the worst possible version of my boyfriend got arrested might be, I would probably have imagined violence, cheating, drugs, something explosive and obvious. I would not have imagined administrative parasitism. I would not have imagined a man who loved being perceived as reliable while quietly grafting pieces of my legal identity onto his own collapsing life. And yet even then, even after all of that, the stupidest part of my brain still spent weeks asking whether any of it had been real. Not the fraud, not the lies, the relationship. Did he ever love me? Did he ever mean the plans? The trips? The birthday dinners? The little domestic jokes? Or had I simply been a convenient person shaped like a girlfriend? I don't think the answer is clean enough to satisfy anyone. I think he probably did love me in the limited way selfish people love those who make their lives function better. I think he liked my steadiness, my competence, the way I made ordinary life run on time. I think he admired me when my skills were serving him and resented the possibility of accountability when they might stop. I think he felt genuine tenderness sometimes and still used me anyway. I think those things coexist more often than people like to admit, which is what makes them dangerous. The last time I saw him in person was outside the courthouse for a procedural hearing I only attended because my lawyer said it might be useful for me to understand the scope of the investigation. Adrian was thinner, paler. His hair needed cutting. He looked like a man whose self-image had finally been made to stand in public without makeup. He saw me before I could avoid him. For one horrible second I thought he was going to walk over. Instead, he just stood there across the steps with that same expression he used to get whenever he believed I was being unfair during ordinary arguments. The expression that said he could imagine my emotional reality only as an obstacle to his own. Then he actually had the nerve to mouth, "I'm sorry." No sound, just the shape of it. I turned away, not because I was weak, because there was nothing in that apology I hadn't already outgrown. The anonymous person never contacted me again after the second message. Sometimes I still think about them, about whether it really was Marius, or a woman Adrian had used before, or someone inside the company who saw enough to feel guilty. Whoever it was, they were the first person to tell me the truth in the only way they safely could. They didn't save me from all of it. That had already happened, but they saved me from defending him blindly in the crucial first hours, and I know enough now to understand how much worse things could have become if I had spent that first night deleting evidence, repeating his excuses, or walking back into the flat prepared to protect a man who had never protected me. If this had been a real advice post written while it was unfolding, I know what I would have asked. What should I do next? Should I believe him? Should I stand by him until I know more? Should I keep this private? Should I wait before involving anyone? Should I worry that leaving makes me disloyal? Now, from the other side of it, I know the answer I wish someone could have forced into my hands immediately. If an anonymous person tells you your partner has been arrested and your partner responds by asking what you told people instead of whether you're safe, pay attention. If your partner tells you not to tell anyone before they tell you the truth, pay attention. If your partner says, "Trust me," while refusing to explain the risk you're in, pay attention. If you discover your name, address, identity, or financial details inside someone else's mess, stop treating their feelings as the main event. Love does not outrank evidence. And sometimes the next thing you should do is not save the relationship, not hear them out one more time, not wait for a kinder explanation. Sometimes the next thing you should do is lock everything down, call your sister, call a lawyer, call the police, document the drawers, photograph the lies exactly where you found them, and understand that betrayal is still betrayal even when the person doing it looks frightened. Story 4. My wife wants my daughter to throw away the last photo of her late mother, and I refused. When I found my daughter on the kitchen floor close to midnight, holding a cracked picture frame against her chest like someone had tried to take the air out of her lungs, I realized this was never really about a photograph. It was about who was allowed to be remembered in our house. I'm writing this because I genuinely do not know anymore whether I'm being a protective father, a terrible husband, or both. I'm Mads, I'm 39, and I live in Odense. My daughter Freya is 13. My late wife Elise died 6 years ago after a sudden brain aneurysm that took all of us apart in less than 48 hours. One moment she was standing barefoot in our kitchen laughing because I had burned garlic bread again, and the next moment I was sitting in a hospital corridor under those ugly white lights, being told that even if she survived surgery, the damage was catastrophic. She never woke up. People talk about death as if it arrives like thunder, loud and undeniable, but for me it arrived like paperwork. First there was the phone call to my sister Astrid because I couldn't form full sentences. Then there was the drive home without Elise, which felt physically impossible, as if the car should have refused to move without her in it. Then there were drawers to open, clothes to fold, insurance forms, signatures, bills, casseroles from neighbors, and the unbearable task of explaining to a 7-year-old that her mother wasn't coming home. I still think that was the cruelest moment of my life. Freya sat on the living room rug with her knees tucked under her chin, looking at me with this absolute trust children have, like fathers can fix reality if they really want to. When I told her, she didn't cry at first. She just asked, but she promised she'd come to my class concert. I have never forgiven the universe for giving me no answer to that. For a long time it was just me and Freya, and grief lived with us like a third person. It was in the hallway where Elise's coat used to hang, in the supermarket when I automatically reached for the yogurt she liked, in the silence after Freya went to bed when the flat felt too still to belong to the living. We made routines because routines were all we had. Saturday pancakes, Thursday hot chocolate after school in winter, walking through Monk Mows when the weather was decent. On Elisa's birthday we bought yellow tulips because she loved them. On the anniversary of her death we stayed home, ordered pizza, and looked through photos only if Freya wanted to. The picture at the center of all this was never expensive or even especially artistic. It was a simple photograph taken in Nyhavn during a weekend in Copenhagen, less than a year before Elise died. Freya was 6 in the picture, wrapped in a red scarf, missing one front tooth, sitting on Elise's lap on a bench by the canal. Elise looked straight into the camera, hair blown half across her face, laughing at something I'd said. You could see part of my hand in the corner because I took the photo one-handed while trying not to drop a coffee. It wasn't framed in silver or anything grand, just a plain oak frame we bought later from a shop in town because Freya wanted that specific photo by her bed. For years it sat on her nightstand. She talked to it sometimes when she thought I didn't hear. Not all the time, not in a way that worried me, just the way children try to keep a doorway open to someone they miss. I met my current wife Katrine 3 years ago. She worked in administration at a dental clinic near where my office had moved. We met because I came in with a cracked molar and left with her laughing at the fact that I was more embarrassed by needing a bib around my neck than by the actual pain. She was warm, quick, practical, and at the beginning being with her felt like stepping into sunlight after years of gray weather. She had a son, Jonas, who is now 11. He's a decent kid, bright, slightly obsessed with football, the sort of boy who leaves half-built Lego projects in places guaranteed to injure adult feet. Katrine had been divorced from Jonas's father, Rasmus, for years, and the way she handled life impressed me. She seemed efficient without being cold, organized without being rigid. She knew how to make plans. When you've spent years surviving day by day, competence can look a lot like safety. I was honest from the beginning that I wasn't looking for a replacement for Elise and I wasn't looking for someone to replace Freya's mother. Katrine said she understood completely. She said something I remember almost word for word. Love isn't a chair with only one seat. You don't have to push one person out to make room for another. At the time, hearing that felt like the greatest possible relief. It made me trust her. It made me believe she understood the shape of our lives. For the first year, things were mostly good. Not perfect, because blended families are never perfect, but manageable. Katrine moved into my house after 18 months, and Jonas moved in too except for alternate weekends with his father. Freya was cautious but polite. She has always been more inward than Jonas, more observant. She doesn't like loud conflict, and if she senses tension she tends to go quiet and retreat to her room. Jonas, by contrast, says whatever he thinks the moment he thinks it. That led to the usual friction over bathrooms, noise, television, and who had taken the charger again, but nothing dramatic. If I'm being completely fair, the first signs of trouble were subtle and easy to dismiss. Katrine would suggest we put away some of Elise's old recipe cards because the kitchen drawers are overflowing. She'd ask whether Freya still needed the memory box under her bed, since it mostly held old birthday cards, a perfume bottle cap, hospital bracelets, and random bits of paper she refused to throw out. She once said, very casually, that maybe it would be healthier if the house looked a bit more like the family that lives in it now. I remember freezing when she said that, because I knew what she meant without her having to explain. But then she kissed me on the cheek and started talking about paint colors for the hallway, and I told myself I was overreacting. That became a pattern. Small comments, small rearrangements, nothing so overt I could point to it and say this is wrong, this is the line. Elisa's old mug disappeared from the back of the cupboard. The knitted blanket her mother made for us got folded into a storage chest because it didn't match the sitting room anymore. Freya's drawing of her, Elise, and me at the seaside was taken off the fridge when Katrine put up a meal planner and a school calendar. Whenever I noticed, Katrine had a reasonable explanation. We need space. We're organizing. We're decluttering. We're moving forward. And that phrase, moving forward, started to become one I hated. I don't think grief has a forward direction. I think it just changes temperature. Some days it is cold enough to numb you, other days hot enough to scorch. But I don't think you leave it behind like an old address. Especially not when you are a child whose mother died before she got old enough to become a person separate from the word mum. Freya never said outright that Katrine made her uncomfortable. She is loyal almost to a fault and terrified of being the source of conflict. But I started noticing how she'd pause before mentioning Elise in front of Katrine. If Jonas talked about his dad, nobody blinked. If Freya mentioned her mum, there was often this tiny silence first, this hesitation in the room, like everyone was waiting to see whether it would make things awkward. I hate myself for not naming that sooner. One evening about 8 months after Katrine moved in, I came upstairs and heard voices from Freya's room. Not shouting, just low and tense. The door was partly open. Katrine was standing by the nightstand holding the framed photo, and Freya was on the bed with her shoulders locked tight. Katrine was saying, "I'm not saying you can't miss her, sweetheart. I'm just saying keeping this right beside your bed every single day isn't helping you live in the present." Freya's face was red. She saw me and immediately looked relieved, which should have told me everything. I asked what was going on. Katrine smiled in that strained way adults do when they've already decided they're right. She said she was just talking to Freya about maybe putting some important things somewhere special instead of on display all the time. I asked whose idea that was. She said, "Mine, because I care about her." I told her the picture stays where Freya wants it. Simple as that. Katrine put it back down, but later that night she told me I'd undermined her. I said she had overstepped. She said she was trying to help Freya stop living in a shrine. I said a single photo on a bedside table is not a shrine. She said I was too emotionally involved to be objective. I said of course I was emotionally involved. My child's dead mother wasn't an abstract issue. We slept with our backs to each other, which was becoming more common. After that, things improved just enough for me to believe we had turned a corner. That was my mistake. I keep thinking about how often adults confuse a temporary lull with genuine resolution. We want peace so badly that we mistake silence for healing. About 2 months ago, Katrine began talking much more often about blending properly. She wanted family photos updated, holiday traditions simplified, storage cleared. She said Jonas sometimes felt like a guest in my house because there were still too many traces of a life from before them. I asked what traces she meant. She gestured vaguely toward books, furniture, and the general fact that we had existed before she arrived. We argued about it in the kitchen while the children were upstairs. She said she was tired of feeling like she was competing with a ghost. That was the first time she used the word ghost, and it made something in me go rigid. I told her Elise wasn't her competition because dead people don't compete. They haunt, maybe, if you let guilt and longing turn them into something larger than life, but they do not compete. Katrine said that was easy for me to say when I wasn't the one trying to build a marriage in a house where another woman was still everywhere. I looked around. There were no portraits of Elise in the sitting room. No wedding photo on the wall. No closet preserved untouched. There was one small box in Freya's room, a few recipe cards in a drawer, and a photo on a nightstand. If that was everywhere, then the real problem was not quantity. It was existence. She cried then, and because I loved her, because I still do in some confused broken way, I softened. She said she wanted to feel chosen. She said she wanted our home to reflect our life now, not my old life. I said she was chosen. I married her. I made space for her and Jonas. I changed routines. I repainted rooms. I compromised on furniture, holidays, budgets, school pickups, everything normal people compromise on when they build a life together. But I would not ask my daughter to erase her mother in order to soothe an adult's insecurity. Katrine said I was twisting her words. Maybe she believed that, maybe she still does. Last week everything finally detonated. It was a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays are the days I work later and Astrid picks Freya up from school if needed. But Astrid had a meeting, So Freya went home with Jonas on the bus and was in the house with Katrine for about an hour before I got there. When I walked in, the atmosphere was wrong in the way houses can feel wrong before anyone speaks. Jonas was in the sitting room pretending to watch football highlights but clearly listening for movement upstairs. Katrine was chopping carrots with the kind of force that suggests the carrots have personally offended her. I asked where Freya was. Katrine said, in her room. Sulking. I asked why. She said, because I asked her to do one simple, healthy thing, and she decided to be dramatic. My stomach dropped. I went upstairs immediately. Freya was sitting on her bed, very still, hands clenched together so tightly her knuckles were white. Her nightstand was empty except for a lamp and a half-read novel. I knew before I asked. I said, "Where's the picture?" She looked at the floor and said, "Katrine took it." I asked where it was. Freya shrugged, and that nearly undid me more than tears would have. Children shrug like that when they're trying not to hope you can fix something. I went back downstairs and asked Katrine where she had put it. She didn't even look ashamed. She said she had removed it because the situation had become unhealthy. She said Freya needed encouragement to accept the family she has now instead of clinging to the family she lost. I asked again, more loudly, where the photo was. She said, I told her it was time to let go. I remember gripping the edge of the counter so hard my fingers hurt. I asked whether she had thrown it away. She said she had put it out with some old things, and that if I insisted on keeping every relic of the past, then maybe I was the one preventing Freya from healing. That was when I shouted. I'm not proud of it, but I did. I said it was not her decision, not her memory, not her grief, and absolutely not her right. Jonas started crying in the sitting room. Katrine shouted back that she was sick of being treated like the villain for trying to create a stable home. She said no therapist in the world would recommend a 13-year-old worshipping a dead parent like a saint. I told her to stop talking. She kept talking. She said Elise had been gone for 6 years, and if Freya still needed a bedside altar, then maybe someone should admit that my parenting had failed. I think that sentence changed something permanently in me. I went outside to the bins. It had rained earlier, and the paving stones were slick. I opened the recycling first, then the general waste. Nothing. I went back in and demanded to know exactly where she had put it. She said she had left it beside the donation bags in the utility room because she didn't want a scene. A scene, as if the problem was presentation. The frame was there, leaning against a box of old kitchen appliances and Jonas's outgrown winter boots. The glass was cracked across one corner. I just stood staring at it for a moment because something about the crack made the whole act feel even uglier. It wasn't only that she had taken it, it was that she had handled it carelessly enough for it to break, then left it there as if it were junk waiting for a better owner. I picked it up and took it upstairs. Freya didn't cry when I gave it back to her. She touched the crack with one finger and asked, very quietly, "Did I do something wrong?" I sat on the floor in front of her and said no, absolutely not. None of this was her fault. She nodded like she heard the words but didn't fully believe them. Then she asked the question I have not stopped hearing since. If she stays, do I have to hide Mum? I had no answer ready because any honest answer felt catastrophic. That night, after the kids were in their rooms, Katrine and I had the worst argument of our marriage. It started in the kitchen and ended in the hallway because at some point I couldn't stand being in the same room with her. She said I had humiliated her in front of the children. I said she had broken my daughter's trust. She said I was prioritizing a dead woman over my living wife. I said protecting Freya is not the same thing as choosing Elise over her. She said everything in this house bends around grief and she is tired of acting like that is normal. I said grief after losing a mother at 7 is normal. She said not 6 years later. I said there is no expiry date on love. She said maybe there should be an expiry date on performative mourning. That phrase made me see red. Performative, as if my daughter's attachment to a single photograph was theater staged to inconvenience her stepmother. I told Katrine I wanted her to leave for a few days. She stared at me like she couldn't believe I'd said it. She asked whether I was serious. I said yes. She said this was my solution, to throw my wife out because my teenager is overattached to a picture. I said my solution was to create immediate distance after she violated my child's emotional safety. She said I was talking like a social worker. I said maybe someone should, since basic empathy had apparently left the building. She called her mother, Birgit, and within an hour Birgit was at the house acting as if I had committed some great cruelty by asking Katrine for space. Birgit has always been polite to my face in that very Danish way that somehow feels colder than open hostility. That night she wasn't polite. She said I had never truly let Katrine become part of the household. She said widowers often idealize the past and punish new partners for not living up to a fantasy. She said children need structure, not indulgence. I said children who lose a parent need compassion from the adults who enter their lives, not power struggles. Birgit said I was allowing Freya to control the emotional climate of the home. Imagine saying that about a 13-year-old whose mother died. Katrine packed a bag, crying hard enough that Jonas got frightened. That part won hate. Whatever else is true, Jonas did not deserve any of this. He kept asking if they were coming back tomorrow and whether I was angry with him. I told him none of this had anything to do with him. He hugged me before leaving, and I nearly lost it then because children will hand you tenderness in the middle of disasters they do not understand. After they left, the house went very quiet. Freya came downstairs in socks and stood in the doorway. She looked smaller than 13. She asked if Katrine hated her. I said no, though I'm still not sure whether that was true or just the least damaging thing I could say. Freya said maybe she should keep the photo in a drawer so things could go back to normal. That's what grief does to children sometimes. It teaches them to negotiate against themselves just to keep love in the room. I told her the picture could stay wherever she wanted. Then I asked her where she wanted to put it now. She said not by the bed anymore. She said if she slept beside it, she'd keep waking up scared someone would take it. That sentence made me feel physically sick. We ended up putting it on the shelf above her desk for the moment, until I could get the glass replaced. She watched me as if she expected me to change my mind halfway through. I kept thinking. I brought this woman into our house. I vouched for her. I told my daughter she was safe. The next morning Freya said she didn't want to go to school. She's usually responsible to the point of stubbornness, so I knew she meant it. I called in late to work and we sat at the kitchen table with tea neither of us drank. She asked whether it was bad that she still talks to her mum sometimes. I said no. She asked if it was weird that she can remember Elise's perfume better than her voice. I said no. She asked if forgetting parts of someone means you love them less. I said no again, and this time I cried, because memory is cruel in the particular ways it fades. Freya cried too, silently, looking down at the table. It struck me then how much private work children do to remain manageable for adults. I called a family counselor I knew through a colleague and got the name of a grief therapist, Helena, in town. Freya has done counseling before, but not recently. Back then it was about surviving the immediate loss. This felt different. This felt like someone had touched a scar and tried to call it clutter. Katrine texted me later that day. Her messages swung between angry and wounded. She said I had made her feel like an intruder in her own marriage. She said she never meant to hurt Freya, only to encourage healthier boundaries with the past. She said I had chosen the harshest possible interpretation of her actions. I replied that taking a dead mother's photograph away from a child and telling her to let go is not an interpretive gray area. She responded that I was refusing to see the pressure she had been under for years. I asked what pressure justified throwing out the photo. She never answered that directly. Instead, she asked if I really wanted to destroy our marriage over one incident. That question has been bothering me because it reveals the whole divide between us. To her it was one incident. To me it was the moment every smaller incident finally stopped pretending to be harmless. When I looked back honestly, I saw the pattern I had excused. The discomfort every time Elise was mentioned. The accidental removal of anything that linked Freya to her mother. The insistence that love for the dead was somehow disloyal to the living. I had seen it all and kept sanding down the edges so I didn't have to face what it meant. Astrid came over that evening with groceries I hadn't asked for because sisters can smell family implosions through walls. She sat with me after Freya went upstairs and listened to everything without interrupting. Then she said, very calmly, "You know this isn't about a frame." I said I knew. She said, "No, I mean it isn't even about Elise. It's about whether Freya is allowed to have a self outside whatever version of family Katrine finds easiest." That landed hard because it was true. Katrine didn't only want less visible grief. She wanted less evidence that Freya came from somewhere and someone before her. Astrid also said something else I needed to hear, which was that love can make decent people selfish in very ordinary ways. Katrine may not have set out to be cruel. She may simply have fed an insecurity for so long that it hardened into entitlement. But intent matters less than impact when you are the adult and the other person is a child. Over the next few days, the phone calls began. Birgit again. Then Poul, Katrine's stepfather. Then even Rasmus, Jonas's father, who called in a surprisingly careful tone to ask if Jonas had done something wrong. I told him no, absolutely not. To his credit, he didn't defend Katrine. He just said Jonas had told him there was a huge fight about a photo, and he wanted to be sure the boy wasn't at the center of it. He also said, almost awkwardly, for what it's worth, if someone tried to bin my kid's picture of his mother, I'd lose my mind. That was the first moment in 3 days I felt less alone. Katrine eventually asked to meet in person. We met at a cafe near Brandt's because neutral ground felt safer than the house. She looked exhausted, so did I, probably. For a few minutes we talked about practical things. Jonas's school bag, whether he'd left football boots at my place, the bills due at the end of the month. Then she said she wanted me to listen without interrupting. I said fine. She told me she has spent the last 2 years feeling like there is no room in my emotional life that is fully hers. She said even on happy days she can feel Elise in the background, not because I compare them out loud, but because there are silences, traditions, private references between me and Freya that shut her out. She said every attempt she made to create new rituals felt secondary, like she was decorating over someone else's wallpaper. She said the photo became symbolic to her because it was always there, every day, a reminder that no matter what she did, she would always be second. I listened, I really did. Some of what she said was painful precisely because it held a grain of truth. Blended families do have invisible fault lines. There are memories some people share and others can never enter. There are jokes born before the newer person arrived. There are dead spouses who are frozen at the age they died, preserved from the ordinary erosion of long marriages. I can understand how that might make someone feel insecure. But understanding is not the same as excusing. When she finished, I asked her one question. Did you ever stop to think what that photo meant to Freya, separate from what it represented to you? She was quiet for a long moment, then said, I thought I was helping her. I asked whether she really believed that, or whether helping herself feel less threatened had become more important than how Freya would experience it. She started crying again. People always imagine the villain in a story as cold. Often they aren't. Often they are deeply emotional about the pain they cause, which somehow makes it messier, not cleaner. Katrine said she knew she had handled it badly. I said badly was an inadequate word. She said she panicked because earlier that day Freya had told Jonas that no one would ever be family like my real mum, and Katrine felt slapped in the face. I said Freya is 13, grieving, and allowed to have feelings that are not diplomatically worded. Katrine said she is also allowed to have feelings. I said yes, but adulthood means managing them without unloading them onto a child. Then she asked the question I had been dreading. What now? I told her I didn't know. Because I truly don't. Part of me still loves the woman I married. I love the version of her who laughed at my awful jokes in the dental chair, who stayed up assembling a desk with me at midnight, who once drove across town in sleet because Freya had forgotten her project at home and was near tears over it. That woman existed. She was not fake, but so is the woman who looked at a grieving child's photo of her dead mother and saw an obstacle. Since then Freya has been quieter than usual. Not dramatic, not explosive, just diminished in a way that frightens me more than anger would. She keeps her bedroom door more closed. She moved the memory box from under the bed into her wardrobe behind a stack of sweaters. Yesterday I saw her slide the photo inside a school folder before coming downstairs for dinner, almost on instinct, and it took everything in me not to react visibly. I don't want to teach her that the only way her mother can remain in her life is through secrecy. Helena met with Freya once already and has another session scheduled. She told me, carefully and without overstepping, that children in bereavement situations are especially sensitive to signs that the deceased parent is being displaced, minimized, or treated as inconvenient. She said the loss then gets reactivated, not as something historical but as something being repeated in the present. That description made me feel sick because it fit exactly. Freya didn't only lose Elise once. In some emotional sense, Katrine tried to make her lose her again. I asked Helena whether reconciliation in a situation like this is even possible. She said possible, yes, but only if the adult who caused the injury takes full responsibility without defensiveness, without reframing it as a misunderstanding, and without expecting the child to hurry up and forgive. She said trust with children is very straightforward that way. They can survive many hard truths. What they do not recover from easily is being told their pain is inconvenient. Katrine wants to come home. She says she will apologize to Freya. She says she understands now. She says she was acting from insecurity and felt excluded and handled it terribly. She says she never wanted to replace Elise, only to stop feeling compared to her. I believe some of that is sincere. I also believe sincerity after the fact does not undo damage. My parents, Leif and Marianne, are firmly on my side, though my mother worries I'm moving too fast toward ending the marriage because of one explosive event. Astrid disagrees with that entirely and says if anything I moved too slowly because I kept ignoring the smaller warnings. Birgit thinks I'm punishing Katrine for failing an impossible test no second wife could pass. A colleague of mine said blended family life after widowhood is always a minefield, which I know he meant sympathetically, but I wanted to ask whether minefields usually involve adults throwing away children's memories. Even Jonas asked if he could come by this weekend because he misses Freya and wants to show me a goal he scored at training. That broke my heart in a fresh way because if this marriage ends, he loses stability too, and none of this is his fault. He didn't ask to be part of a household built over old grief and new insecurity. He's just a boy who wanted everyone to stop shouting. What keeps looping in my head, though, is not the argument with Katrine or Birgit's phone calls or the practical nightmare of separation. It is Freya's voice asking, if she stays, do I have to hide Mum? There are questions children ask that expose the entire moral structure of a situation in one line. That was one of them. If the answer is yes, even partially, then I already know what kind of father I've become, and I don't like it. I have spent years trying to prove to Freya that life after devastation can still contain warmth, safety, and loyalty. I told her when I married Katrine that loving someone new did not mean loving Elise less. I told her families can grow without erasing what came before. If I back down now, if I treat this as a regrettable misunderstanding and ask Freya to be flexible for the sake of peace, then every one of those promises becomes hollow. At the same time, marriage is not nothing. Shared life is not nothing. Love, even damaged love, is not nothing. I know how easy it is on the outside to say leave, full stop, and maybe that is where this ends. But inside a real life, endings drag 100 threads with them. There is Jonas. There is the house. There are finances, routines, history, small kindnesses, all the parts that don't fit neatly into a verdict. There is also the humiliating truth that I keep wondering whether I somehow helped create this by being emotionally split in ways I never fully addressed. Maybe Katrine lived too long with insecurity I acknowledged but never really resolved. Maybe she let resentment rot into something uglier. Maybe I let conflict avoidance do the same. Still, all those maybes circle one fixed fact. She tried to take away the one photograph my daughter keeps close to remember her mother, and she did it while I was not home. I can analyze the marriage from every angle and that fact does not change. Last night I tucked Freya in, though she is technically old enough not to want that anymore. She let me anyway. The photo was back on her desk shelf, the cracked glass removed until I can get the frame repaired. I asked if she wanted a new frame instead. She said no, she wants the same one. She said, it's the one Mum touched. I had to turn my face for a second because grief is not linear, apparently, and neither is parenthood. Before I turned off the light, she asked whether people can be nice to you and still do something unforgivable. I said yes. She asked how you know the difference between a mistake and someone showing who they are. I told her I was still trying to learn that myself. So that's where I am. I refused to make my daughter throw away her late mother's picture. I refused to tell her memory is clutter. I refused to let an adult's jealousy become a child's burden. And now my wife is staying with her mother. My stepson is caught in the middle. My daughter no longer feels fully safe in her own room, and I am standing in the wreckage trying to figure out whether this marriage can survive the thing it has revealed. I don't think the photograph was ever the real issue. The real issue is that my daughter loved her mother openly, and my wife wanted that love edited down until it stopped making her uncomfortable. And I can't decide whether a marriage can come back from that, or whether the moment I found that cracked frame leaning beside the donation bags was the moment it was already over. Story 5. My girlfriend's career expenses are killing our future together, while I keep spending and feel drained. How do I talk to her about it? I thought we were building a life together, but lately it feels like we're both setting money on fire for different reasons and calling it love. I'm Luca, I'm 24, I live in Turin, and my girlfriend Sophia is 27. We've been together a little over 3 years, and I honestly don't know if I'm asking for relationship advice or just trying to hear my own thoughts in a form that doesn't make me feel like a traitor. I love her. I need to say that first because whenever money gets involved, people start sounding colder than they mean to. Sophia is not lazy, selfish, or careless in the simple cartoon villain way people online sometimes reduce partners to. If anything, one of the reasons I fell for her is that she is intense in the best sense. She has ambition, discipline, taste, and this way of speaking about the future that used to make me feel like my life was finally moving in a direction instead of just happening to me. When we met, she was working in fashion production, mostly freelance styling and visual consulting, taking whatever contracts she could get in Turin, Milan, and sometimes Lyon when a contact came through. I was working full-time in customer support for a software company, mostly boring but stable, with the kind of salary you don't brag about but can build a normal life on if you don't act stupid. At the beginning, our differences felt complementary. She was the brave one, the one with taste, vision, contacts, energy. I was the reliable one, the one who remembered deadlines, paid bills on time, compared insurance policies, and didn't have panic attacks over Excel files. At first it was romantic. She would talk about shoots, clients, fabric houses, traveling for fittings, portfolio updates, finding the right photographer, investing in better tools, better clothes, a better phone camera, better makeup, better transport options, better everything. I admired it, truly. I grew up around people who talked about survival, not possibility. My mother, Chiara, worked in a municipal office for 30 years and believed stability was the closest thing to grace a person could ask for. My father, Davide, drove regional delivery routes and still has the kind of shoulders that look permanently tired. In my family, the highest compliment was not brilliant or gifted. It was serious, meaning dependable, meaning not a burden, meaning you paid what needed paying and didn't gamble on dreams unless the odds were insultingly good. So Sophia felt like sunlight to me when I first knew her. She had grown up partly in Turin and partly in Nice because her mother, Mireille, is French and her father, Enzo, moved around for engineering contracts. She had this easy way of switching between Italian and French, this polished confidence that made every room seem slightly underdressed until she entered it. She didn't look wealthy exactly, but she looked like someone raised with the expectation that good things were available if you worked for them hard enough and with enough style. I had never dated anyone like that. My ex before her, Julia, had been sweet and practical and deeply suspicious of anyone who used the word curate outside a museum. Sophia could say things like, "This project isn't aligned with where I'm positioning myself," with a straight face, and instead of rolling my eyes, I found it fascinating. I know how that sounds. I know I probably romanticized her long before I understood her. In the first year, money wasn't exactly easy, but it was still manageable because everything felt temporary. Temporary chaos, temporary hustle, temporary imbalance while she got traction and while I moved up at work. We didn't live together right away. She had a small apartment near San Salvario with good light and almost no storage, and I was renting a room from an older man named Carlo who only spoke in 2 volumes, whisper and outrage. We spent most nights at hers because Carlo hated guest energy after 10-page M, which was his phrasing, not mine. Back then, the expensive parts of Sophia's life still looked like investments with a clear future attached. A new laptop because her old one kept freezing while editing client decks. Train tickets to Milan because all the real opportunities are there. Better shoes because appearance mattered in her field. Portfolio printing because digital wasn't always enough. A short course in brand direction. Another short course in production management. A professional headshot session because she hated how amateur her profile looked. Subscription software. Industry dinners where she insisted it was important to be seen. Cabs when she was running late to meetings. Coffee meetings that were somehow never just coffee. Gifts for clients around Christmas that seemed insane to me until she explained that relationships were everything in freelance work. And at first I believed, because honestly a lot of it made sense. Careers do require investment, creative careers especially. Not every expense is vanity. Not every expensive choice is irresponsible. I know that. I still know that. The problem is that investment is one of those beautiful words that can cover a lot of rot if nobody asks when the return is supposed to arrive. She started asking to borrow small amounts. Never in a dramatic way. That would have been easier to resist. It was always soft, temporary, embarrassed but hopeful. Can you cover dinner? Client paid late. Can I send you my half of the weekend after the invoice clears? I need to book this train now before the price doubles. My card is a disaster this month. I hate asking. You know I'm good for it. And she usually was, at least at first. Not always quickly, but eventually enough that I didn't feel used. We kept an informal mental ledger, which already in hindsight was a stupid arrangement because vague money always grows teeth. But at the time, it felt intimate and flexible, like something trusting couples do. We were building together. That was the word hanging over everything. Together. Then we moved in. I know couples say this all the time, but the day-to-day logistics of love can expose things that pure emotion hides very effectively. We found a one-bedroom flat in Turin near Sit Turin, nothing luxurious, but bright, close enough to transport, and just polished enough to make us feel like our 20s hadn't been entirely wasted. The rent was high for me and acceptable to her, which probably should have been the first warning that our internal scales were different. I remember sitting with her at the kitchen counter before we signed, running numbers, talking about groceries and utilities and internet and whether we'd need a new washing machine within a year. Sophia was excited in that contagious way of hers. She said living together would help both of us save. She said we were past the stage of drifting. She said having a proper base would make her look more serious to clients if she needed to host meetings or fittings. She said my commute would be easier. She said our life would feel more intentional. I wanted that so badly that I think I ignored the parts that should have worried me. Her share of the rent was supposed to come partly from more stable retainer work she believed she was about to secure with a Milan-based brand consultant named Beatrice. She was confident, too confident, maybe, but not obviously delusional. She had contacts, she had talent, she had worked hard. It didn't feel insane to trust her. For a while, it was good. Better than good, honestly. There is a happiness in those first months of living with someone you love that is almost embarrassingly domestic. Buying spices together, arguing gently over where mugs should go, falling asleep on the sofa because you started a film too late, learning the rhythm of each other's mornings, her leaving lipstick marks on wine glasses, me pretending to hate scented candles and then silently missing them whenever she was away overnight. We hosted friends a few times. My friend Matteo came over with his girlfriend Aliska from Brno, and Sophia made the apartment look like something from an interior magazine by moving 3 objects and dimming a lamp. Her friend Ines from Marseille visited and said our place had good couple energy, which I laughed at but secretly loved. If the story stopped there, I wouldn't be writing this. It shifted slowly enough that I kept adjusting to each new normal before realizing there shouldn't have been this many new normals in the first place. Her income became more unpredictable. Not non-existent, just inconsistent in the most destructive way possible. Enough to create hope, not enough to create stability. One month she'd land a decent project and pay for dinners, groceries, and even surprise me with tickets to a concert in Milan. The next month she'd be waiting on payments, covering a trip up front, or pouring money into some critical, professional expense that meant she suddenly couldn't contribute fully to rent. She always had a reason, and again, the worst part is that the reasons were rarely absurd in isolation. New portfolio shoot, updated website, networking event in Paris, rental of clothing rails for a presentation, deposit for shared studio access, emergency tailoring, industry conference pass, better skincare because people in my field notice everything, a ring light setup, a tablet, a premium membership on some creative platform I'd never heard of, courier fees, sample returns, dry cleaning, replacement luggage after her old suitcase wheel broke, a train booked last minute because, if I miss this meeting, I disappear from their radar. You can ruin a household with completely understandable expenses if there are enough of them and nobody is brave enough to say the pile is on fire. At the same time, and this is the part that makes me feel like a hypocrite, I was not exactly behaving like a saint either. I didn't pour money into career building the way she did, but I started spending more and more in my own ugly, quiet, exhausted way. Food delivery because I was too drained to cook after covering for her absences or cleaning up after late nights. New headphones because mine broke and I wanted one nice thing that felt like mine. Video games on sale that I barely played. Random subscriptions I forgot to cancel. Clothes I didn't need because I felt shabby standing next to her. Weekends away that I agreed to even when I knew we shouldn't because I was afraid our relationship would start feeling like a spreadsheet if I said no too often. Drinks with colleagues when I should have gone home. Little online purchases that felt harmless until I added them up. It wasn't glamorous spending. It was leakage, emotional leakage. I think that's part of why I feel so confused. If Sophia were recklessly wasting money on nonsense while I lived on lentils and moral purity, I would know what to do. But that isn't us. She spends like the future depends on it. I spend like the present is too heavy to carry without rewards. Neither of us looks irresponsible from the inside of our own logic. But together we're becoming a financial sinkhole. The first time I really panicked was over a dishwasher. That sentence sounds ridiculous, but I think everyone has one moment where the problem stops being abstract. Our old dishwasher started making a noise that sounded like it was swallowing cutlery whole. I wanted to get it repaired or, if necessary, replace it with something decent but basic. Sophia said if we were replacing it anyway, we should buy one that matched the rest of the kitchen better because appearances mattered if people came over. I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. We stood in an appliance shop on a Saturday afternoon having what felt, on the surface, like a conversation about stainless steel finishes and integrated design. In reality, we were arguing about something much deeper. She wanted a more expensive model because cheap things cost twice. I wanted the lower-priced option because the difference was nearly half our grocery budget for the month. She said I always saw spending as loss. I said she always saw spending as identity. She said I was being small-minded. I said she was acting like clients were secretly grading our kitchen. We bought the cheaper one, but she spent the whole evening quiet in that polished, disappointed way that made me feel like I had personally lowered the cultural standard of our home. A week later she spent almost the same difference on a dinner in Milan after a meeting because it would have been weird to leave when everyone stayed. That's when resentment really entered the room and sat down between us. I started noticing everything, every candle, every beauty product, every train, every coffee, every necessary purchase delivered in minimalist packaging. She started noticing me noticing, which made her defensive. I'd ask neutral questions like when a client invoice was due, and she'd hear accusation. She'd say she needed to buy something for work, and I'd hear a leak opening under the floorboards. We never had the clean financial fight couples are supposed to have where both people sit down with numbers and speak like adults. Instead, we had 50 ugly mini-fights disguised as conversations about one bill, one transfer, one dinner, one weekend, one broken lamp, one late payment. Then there was the holiday. I wish I could explain that trip without sounding stupid, but I think stupidity needs to be admitted fully if I want honest advice. Last summer we went to the Algarve with another couple, my colleague Tomas from Porto and his girlfriend Neve from Galway. We could not really afford it. I knew that, Sophia knew that, but it had been a hard year, and she said we needed something beautiful that belonged to us and not to work stress. She found flights that were too good to miss. The apartment was worth stretching for. I told myself memories mattered. I told myself couples who never enjoy life together end up resenting that too. I told myself once her next contract landed, things would even out. Instead, I spent most of the trip with this low electrical anxiety under my skin. Every dinner, every beach club, every taxi, every round of drinks carried a second invisible price tag in my head. Sophia looked radiant the whole time. Sun-browned, laughing, dressed in effortless linens I suspect cost more than she ever admitted. She posted photos that made our life look cinematic. People commented things like, "You too are goals." Meanwhile I was secretly moving money from my savings to cover card payments and telling myself I'd recover next month. On the last night, after too much wine, Tomas asked whether Sophia's freelance work was finally reaching the point where she could slow down a little. He meant it kindly. Sophia smiled and gave a polished answer about reinvesting during a growth phase. Neve nodded like that sounded smart. I said nothing because if I had opened my mouth, I might have laughed in the wrong way. When we came home, I checked my account and saw that after rent, bills, and card payments, I had less money left than I'd had as a student. I had a full-time job. That realization did something ugly to me. I became meaner in my head. Not openly, not all at once, but internally. I'd see her booking another train and think, here we go. I'd hear about a fantastic opportunity and think, what fresh disaster is this? She'd come home excited after a meeting and I'd already be calculating what her excitement was about to cost us. That's not who I want to be. I hate that version of myself, the one who turns his partner's ambition into a threat in his own mind. But I also hate the helplessness of feeling like I'm the floor under a machine nobody switches off. I need to explain something else that makes this harder. Sophia is not extravagant in all the obvious ways. She isn't buying designer bags every month or booking luxury hotels on my card. If you met us casually, you might even think I was the careless one. I order takeout too much. I say yes to after-work drinks. I replace gadgets instead of repairing them. I buy things when I'm stressed, not expensive things usually, just enough small things that the total becomes embarrassing. I know I've used spending as anesthesia. When I feel powerless, I buy convenience. When I feel overlooked, I buy little rewards. When I feel tired of always being the responsible one, I buy myself temporary permission not to be. And lately I'm tired all the time. Not dramatic burnout where you collapse and change your life, just this dense everyday fatigue. The kind that makes every conversation about money feel like a courtroom hearing you're too tired to prepare for. I wake up already braced for some practical issue. Rent, gas bill, groceries, her delayed invoice, a train she needs booked today, a birthday gift for someone in her network because it matters. My credit card payment, the fact we still haven't built back our emergency fund after last winter's heating costs. The fact my parents don't know how close to broke I've felt at times because I've been too ashamed to admit that living with someone stylish and ambitious has somehow made me poorer and lonelier than renting a room from Carlo ever did. A few months ago, my mother asked me, very casually, whether Sophia and I had started saving for anything concrete. She didn't mean marriage necessarily, though in my family any question about the future carries 3 implied church bells. She just meant savings, stability, a bigger flat one day, maybe a car, maybe the ability to survive 3 bad months without fear. I lied. I said we were working on it. After the call, I sat in the kitchen for 10 minutes staring at the fruit bowl like it had accused me personally. Because what future are we building? That's the question that keeps finding me when I'm brushing my teeth, or on the tram, or pretending to listen in meetings. I love Sophia. I want a future. But the version we are currently building feels decorative from the outside and rotten at the beams. She talks about maybe moving to Milan in a couple of years if the right opportunities come. Sometimes she talks about Paris because she still has connections there and speaks French well enough to work. Sometimes she says maybe we should try to buy a place eventually, something small but beautiful, and every time she says it my chest tightens because we can barely maintain the life we already have. Buying a place feels like discussing yachts while drifting toward rocks. The worst fight we've had so far happened over a coat. It was December, freezing, and she had an event in Milan connected to a brand launch. She wanted to buy a camel-colored wool coat she'd been talking about for weeks. It was expensive enough that my first response was honestly laughter because I assumed she meant someday, not right then. She said it was professional, timeless, and exactly the kind of thing that mattered in rooms where people notice everything. I asked whether people notice everything was paying our internet bill. She told me not to be vulgar. I told her debt was vulgar too, but somehow less photogenic. That escalated quickly. She said I did not respect her work because I only understood salaries and monthly payslips. I said she hid overspending inside the language of ambition because it sounded nobler than wanting a certain life. She said I was punishing her for having standards. I said her standards kept somehow drafting themselves against my bank account. She asked whether I was keeping score of what I paid for. I said maybe I had to because apparently nobody else was. She went silent, then started crying in that furious way where tears seemed to insult the person having them. I felt awful immediately, but also not exactly wrong. Which I think is what makes relationships dangerous. Being technically right at the wrong emotional volume can break things just as effectively as being wrong. She didn't buy the coat that day. A week later, after a late payment finally came through, she bought it anyway. I wish I could say the issue is just that she overspends and I'm the suffering boyfriend trying to save us, but it's messier. I think some part of me has also allowed this dynamic because it gave me an identity I secretly liked. The stable one, the mature one, the generous one, the man who supports his partner's dream. There is vanity in being needed. There is ego in being the reliable partner. And because I liked that version of myself, I didn't set boundaries early. I kept helping, covering, advancing, absorbing. Then when the cost became too high, I started resenting her for a role I had partially volunteered for. Still, volunteering to help is not the same as agreeing to become the safety net beneath every shiny risk. There have been moments where she seems to understand. I don't want to paint her as totally oblivious. Once, after she realized I'd paid the electricity bill, the internet, and most of the groceries in the same week while she was waiting on money, she came home with wine and made dinner and apologized. A real apology, not the polished kind. She said she knew the instability affected me more than she admitted. She said she hated feeling behind and dependent. She said she worried I saw her as all aspiration and no foundation. I told her I didn't. That was only half true, but I meant the better half in the moment. Another time she admitted that her field encourages a constant state of performance, and it's hard to know when something is genuinely necessary and when you're just afraid of disappearing if you stop investing in yourself. That hit me because it was honest and sad. Entire industries are built on making people feel one purchase away from legitimacy and one misstep away from irrelevance. I know that. I know she lives inside a machine designed to make insecurity look professional. But sympathy doesn't pay rent either. Over the last 6 months, it's become impossible for me to ignore that I'm changing around this problem in ways I don't like. I dread opening banking apps. I put off looking at statements because I know I'll feel stupid. I say yes to her spending ideas in the moment and stew afterward. I spend in secret on stupid little things because, somewhere deep down, if I'm going to feel financially doomed anyway, part of me wants to at least choose my own brand of foolishness. That's the ugliest truth here. Sometimes I think, if I have to constantly be responsible for both of us, then I deserve this takeaway, these shoes, this weekend train to see friends, this overpriced lunch, whatever it is. Which of course only tightens the knot. There was also an incident with my brother that keeps replaying in my head. My older brother, Alessio, lives in Genoa with his wife, Marta, and their son Leo. Alessio is practical to the point of being annoying. He once returned a bottle of olive oil because the price per liter had gone up too much compared to the same producer last season. This is who he is. I love him, but he has the financial sensuality of a brick. We visited them in February, and after dinner he and I went downstairs to smoke on the street even though I technically quit 2 years ago. He asked how things were going. I gave him the standard vague answer. He kept looking at me the way only siblings can, like they're waiting for you to stop performing. Finally he said, "You look tired in a money way." I laughed because that was annoyingly precise. I told him things were just a bit stretched. He asked if stretched meant temporary or structural. Again, annoyingly precise. I said probably structural. He was quiet for a while, then said, "If it's structural, love won't fix it. You need a system or an exit." I got angry immediately. Defensive. I said he didn't know our relationship, didn't understand creative work, was reducing everything to numbers. He shrugged and said maybe, but if I was paying for a life I couldn't maintain and feeling guilty for noticing, that wasn't romance. That was drift. Then he flicked ash into the gutter and added, "And if you're also spending out of stress, you're both feeding the same fire from opposite sides." I hated how correct that sounded. I didn't tell Sophia about that conversation. Not because it was secret, but because I knew she'd hear contempt in it, and maybe she'd be right. Alessio's patience for people who build identities around unstable lifestyles is not large. But his phrase stayed with me. Same fire from opposite sides. That's exactly what it feels like. Sophia spends toward a future image. I spend away from present strain. Either way, the money leaves. We've talked in fragments, but not truly talked. Not with all the honesty this requires. Every time I get close, something stops me. Part of it is guilt because she is older than me and in a more precarious field, And I know how cruel it would sound if I basically said your dream is eating us alive. Part of it is shame because I haven't been disciplined either, so I feel disqualified from raising the issue. Part of it is fear because what if she hears the real thing underneath my words, which is not just, we need a budget, but, I'm starting to doubt whether our lives are compatible. That feels enormous, too enormous. Once you say something like that out loud, you don't get to stuff it back in the drawer. There's also this other layer that maybe matters. I think Sophia likes the version of me that doesn't make her feel small. The supportive version, the one who says yes, or at least not no. The one who admires rather than audits. Early in our relationship, she used to say I made her feel safe. I loved hearing that, but now I sometimes think what she meant was that I didn't interrupt her momentum. I didn't question the structure. I didn't ask the kind of grounded questions that might make her feel exposed. And I'm afraid that if I finally do, she won't see me as safe anymore. She'll see me as one more person trying to reduce her life to practicality. Maybe that is unfair. Maybe I'm pre-blaming her to avoid the conversation. I know people do that. Last month was the clearest warning yet. Her client in Milan delayed payment on a big project. Not shocking, unfortunately. Meanwhile, our annual insurance payment hit, our grocery costs had crept up again, and my company announced that bonuses would be smaller this year because of some restructuring nonsense. Sophia also wanted to attend a branding summit in Paris because 2 people she knows said it would be full of useful contacts. I said we couldn't afford it. She said she couldn't afford not to go if she wanted to keep growing. I said those are not the same sentence. She said I was talking like an accountant, not a partner. I said maybe one of us had to. She walked out and stayed with her friend Camille for the night. The next day she came back calmer and said she would skip Paris. I felt relieved, then immediately guilty that my relief came from her disappointment. That seems to be the rhythm now. She gives something up, I feel safer and worse at the same time. And because life likes irony, the same week I argued with her about Paris, I bought myself a new office chair on installment because my back had been killing me and I was sick of working from a seat that felt like punishment. Was the chair necessary? Kind of. Was the installment plan smart given everything else? Probably not. Did I tell her before buying it? No. I mentioned it afterward like it was a practical update rather than a decision. She stared at me for a second and asked, so when you spend, it's health. When I spend, it's indulgence. I didn't have a clean answer because obviously there was truth in that. She was quiet the rest of the evening, and I could tell she felt judged and counter-judged at the same time. Honestly, so did I. I keep circling the same question. How do I talk to her about this without making it sound like I'm accusing her of being the whole problem when I know I'm not blameless? Because I don't want one of those self-righteous speeches where the speaker has secretly edited themselves into innocence. I'm not innocent. I'm just more exhausted. I'm exhausted by the unpredictability. Exhausted by looking stable from the outside while internally calculating every transfer. Exhausted by feeling like future plans are props we discuss in a set built on unpaid invoices and card statements. Exhausted by my own reaction to all of it, which has been avoidance, leakage, resentment, then guilt about resentment. A few nights ago, we were at dinner with friends, and one of them asked if we ever talk about getting married. Not in a pressing way, just one of those casual conversations that happen when everyone has had enough wine to speak like the future is simple. Sophia smiled and said, one day, when we've both done a few more things. Everyone laughed. I laughed too, but inside I felt this cold drop in my stomach because all I could think was, done what? Spent what? Pretended what? On the walk home she slipped her hand into mine and started talking about a possible project in Florence this summer, and I realized I was barely listening because I was mentally calculating whether the month after Florence would be another, tight one. That can't be good. When your partner starts talking and your brain converts their sentences into forecasted expenses, something is deeply wrong. I've also noticed I've started fantasizing about boring things. Not affairs, not escape in some dramatic cinematic sense. Just boring peace. A month where the bills are paid and nobody says, investment, or opportunity, or just this once. A savings account that actually rises instead of being rebuilt like a sandcastle after every wave. Buying groceries without also carrying invisible bitterness. Knowing what our life costs and living inside that number. I don't think that's an unreasonable dream. But right now it feels almost luxurious. I don't want to blindside her. I don't want to spring this on her in the middle of another small argument and say things harsher than I mean. I also don't want to keep waiting until I'm so full of frustration that the conversation comes out as an accusation instead of a request for change. Part of me thinks we need an actual sit down with every number on the table. Income, debts, subscriptions, recurring costs, average monthly spending, personal spending, work-related expenses, everything. Not vague memory, real numbers. I think if I don't see the full picture, I'll keep alternating between panic and denial. But another part of me worries that if I insist on that, she'll hear control where I mean clarity. She's very sensitive to feeling managed, and I do understand why. Freelance life already humiliates you enough without your boyfriend turning into an auditor. And yet, what is the alternative? Keep drifting? Keep helping when I can, resenting when I do, and then spending to soothe the resentment? That feels like slow poison. Sometimes I also wonder if age plays into this more than we admit. She is 27, which is not old obviously, but I think she feels pressure. She sees peers moving up, becoming visible, becoming established, moving to Milan, Paris, Berlin, getting bigger projects, dressing the part, living the part. I'm 24 and still young enough that some instability looks temporary to the world. Maybe she feels she cannot afford to slow down or become more modest now because that would mean losing ground permanently. If that's true, I sympathize. I really do, but I can't become collateral damage to her professional panic. I don't even know whether the real issue is the money or what the money represents. To me, money represents safety, honesty, structure, future possibility. To her, I think money often represents mobility, legitimacy, visibility, not being left behind. No wonder every spending conversation feels moral. We're not arguing over numbers. We're arguing over what kind of fear gets priority. I love her enough that I don't want to humiliate her. I also love myself enough, at least I'm trying to, that I don't want to keep living like this. So I guess I'm asking, how do I have this conversation in a way that is honest, adult, and not instantly destructive? How do I say, your career expenses are swallowing us and my own stress spending is making it worse, without turning it into, your dream is stupid and I'm the victim? How do I admit that I'm drained and scared without sounding like I'm withdrawing support from her as a person? Because if I'm really honest, that's what terrifies me most. Not the argument itself, not even the possibility that she'll be angry. It's that she might understand perfectly, and the solution might still reveal that we want fundamentally different lives. And if that's true, I don't know whether I'm supposed to fight for us harder or finally admit that love is not automatically a budget, a system, or a future. Story number 6. Am I wrong for refusing to pay my friend back for a concert ticket I couldn't use? I didn't think saying, I'm not paying you for a ticket I never had the chance to use, would end a 10-year friendship, but apparently that one sentence was enough to turn half my social circle into a jury. I'm 27, my name is Nora, and I live in Galway. This happened a few months ago, and I still keep replaying it because every time I think I've settled on, I'm obviously right, someone says something that makes me second-guess myself. So I'm putting it all down the way it happened, because I genuinely want to know whether I'm being unfair or whether I've just let one very forceful person rewrite the entire story. The friend in question is called Aoife. We met when we were 16, in secondary school, and for years she was one of those people I thought would simply always exist in my life in some permanent way. Not necessarily in the dramatic, soulmate friend sense, but in the practical, lived-in sense. She knew my mother's weird habit of freezing everything from soup to birthday cake. I knew which cousin she couldn't stand and why. We'd sat through each other's breakups, job disasters, family arguments, terrible fringes, worse flat shares, and the general humiliations of becoming adults with limited money and unstable confidence. If I'm being completely fair, Aoife has always been one of those people who gets things done. If a trip is happening, she books it. If a table needs reserving, she's already called. If a group chat is dying in endless, I don't mind, what suits everyone? Loops, she bulldozes through and makes a decision. For years I found that reassuring. She was efficient in a way I'm not. I can be indecisive, and I do sometimes put off boring admin tasks until the last possible second. Next to me, she looked dazzlingly competent. The problem is that there's a very thin line between organized and controlling, and I think I spent a long time pretending not to see when she crossed it. The concert was for a singer called Léon Vasseur, a French artist who got very big the last 2 years. Not stadium level huge, but big enough that tickets for his Dublin date sold fast and everyone suddenly started posting his songs with captions about being emotionally destroyed in a sophisticated continental way. I like his music, not obsessively, but enough that when Aoife dropped a message in our group chat saying, "He's playing in Dublin in October, who's in before I book?" I immediately said yes. There were 5 of us in that chat then: me, Aoife, her boyfriend Kian, our friend Blanca, and Blanca's flatmate Marta. 2 of us were definite yeses, 2 were maybes, 1 said he needed to check work. That should have been the moment to wait until people confirmed. Instead, because Aoife is Aoife, she bought 5 tickets within about 11 minutes and then sent a message saying, "Sorted. You can all just Revolut me later." I remember laughing when I saw it because it was exactly the kind of thing she does. I also remember thinking, well, I said yes, so that's fine. The ticket was €92, which felt steep, but concert prices have become insane and I figured I'd make it work. A couple of days later I paid her. That part matters. I paid her almost immediately, because I knew if I didn't, it would become one of those little private tabs she keeps in her head. She never says she keeps score, but she absolutely does. If she bought coffees 3 times in a row, she remembers. If she drove to Clare last spring and you only drove once in return, she remembers. If she covered the Airbnb deposit and everyone paid her back except one person who took an extra week, she remembers that too, and maybe she says, "No worries," out loud, but 6 months later she'll mention how she's always the one sorting things. So I paid the €92 and thought that was the end of it. It should have been the end of it. Then about 3 weeks before the concert, I got offered a temporary contract extension at the design studio where I work. I had been on a very shaky arrangement for months, the kind where everyone talks in vague language about future opportunities, while you smile and quietly check your bank account before buying shampoo. The extension wasn't glamorous, but it came with actual stability for another few months, and it also came with a catch. I had to go to a mandatory client workshop in Cork the same weekend as the concert. At first I thought I could still make both work. The workshop was Friday afternoon and Saturday morning, and the concert was Saturday night in Dublin. In theory, if everything ran on time and I left Cork early enough, I could get a train, race to my cousin's place in Dublin, change, and still make it. It would be stressful, but possible. Then our office manager, a man named Owen who says, "Quick sync," about things that steal 2 hours of your life, sent the actual itinerary. The workshop was running later than expected, and the client dinner on Saturday wasn't optional after all. Attendance was apparently important for visibility, which is corporate language for, "We will notice if you're not there, and we'll attach a personality judgment to it." I was gutted. I'd wanted the concert. More than that, I wanted a weekend that was mine, not another exercise in smiling at wealthy people who say things like, "We're really looking for organic storytelling," without any idea what those words cost in labor. But I also needed the job. Desperately. Rent had gone up, my younger brother was between jobs in Limerick and I'd been helping him a bit, and my savings were so thin they were basically conceptual. So I messaged the group chat the same evening and said, I might be in trouble for the concert. Work has put a mandatory thing in Cork that weekend. I'm trying to figure it out, but if I can't go, I'll transfer my ticket to whoever wants it or we can sell it. Aoife reacted with a thumbs down emoji, which somehow annoyed me more than if she'd just said something blunt. Then she wrote, "Please don't mess this up last minute." I said, "I'm not. I'm literally saying it now, 3 weeks ahead." She replied, "Yeah, but these things become a nightmare." Blanca wrote, "Surely it can be sold if needed?" Aoife said, "Maybe, depends. Also, we're sitting together." That was the first moment I felt that tiny click of irritation. Not because she was wrong that logistics can be annoying, but because of how instantly she positioned me as the person creating chaos, when in reality I was trying to give everyone time to sort it. Still, I kept it light. I said I'd do my best, and if I couldn't go, I'd handle finding someone. Over the next week, I asked around. I mentioned it to my cousin Sarah in Dublin. I mentioned it to a woman named Iben from my old uni course who loves French pop. I even posted on my Instagram close friends story saying I might have a ticket available. A few people replied with the usual, "Ooh, maybe, let me check," which of course means nothing. But I was trying. Meanwhile, Aoife began sending increasingly pointed messages. Not outright nasty, not the kind you can screenshot and say, "Look how cruel she is," but carefully calibrated guilt. "Have you sorted that ticket yet? I really don't want randomers sitting in our row. Can you make this a priority? I hope this doesn't become a thing where I'm chasing you." It was always framed as management, never accusation, which somehow made it more exhausting. I told her twice that I had already paid for the ticket, so I wasn't asking anyone else to cover me. I was just trying to avoid wasting it. She said yes, but if I couldn't sell it, then obviously that was my loss. I agreed. Again, at that point, I thought we were on the same page. Then everything got worse. About 10 days before the concert, my mother called me from Waterford. She almost never calls during my workday unless something is wrong, so I stepped out to answer. It was my Aunt Zofia. She'd had a fall in Wexford, hit her head, and they were keeping her in hospital for observation. My mother doesn't drive long distances anymore because her eyesight at night has become unreliable, and my cousin who usually helps was away in Germany for work. So suddenly I was trying to juggle the cork workshop, the concert issue, and whether I'd need to go down to help my mother with hospital visits. To be clear, Zofia is not just some distant relative I send Christmas texts to. She practically raised me after my parents divorced. She's one of those aunts who remembers every detail you tell her and mails ridiculous birthday cards with terrible puns and €5 notes tucked inside even when you're nearly 30. When I was 12 and got suspended for telling a teacher he had the charisma of cold porridge, she was the one who laughed before telling me I was absolutely not allowed to say things like that in public. So yes, when my mother was upset, I was upset too. That night I messaged Aoife privately and explained more fully. I said I still didn't know if I could make the concert because of work, and now there was a family issue as well. I said I'd keep trying to sell the ticket, but if I dropped off the radar for a day or two, that was why. Her reply was, "I'm sorry about your aunt, but I really need this sorted before the transfer window gets messy." That was it. Not cruel enough to call out directly, not kind enough to feel human. It sat in my chest like a stone. I wrote back, "I know. I'm doing what I can." She heart-reacted the message. The next week blurred into one of those awful adult stretches where everything feels administrative and emotionally expensive at once. Cork became more demanding, not less. Zofia was discharged, then had to go back in after getting dizzy again. My mother was exhausted and snappy. I was taking calls from the train, answering emails after midnight, and checking ticket resale sites in between client notes. In the middle of all that, the concert started to feel ridiculous to me. Not the music itself, just the scale of attention Aoife seemed to think it deserved. I know that sounds harsh, but I was watching my mother cry in a hospital corridor because she was scared for her sister, and then my phone would buzz with, "Any update on the ticket? Need to know ASAP." By 4 days before the concert, I still hadn't found a buyer. A few people had expressed interest, then backed out. One said the price was too high. One could only do half. One asked if I'd take €40, since it's last minute. I probably could have sold it at a loss if I'd been willing to accept almost anything, but because I had already paid the full amount and money was genuinely tight, I kept holding out for something closer to face value. That's when Aoife suddenly changed the terms. She sent me a message saying she'd been talking to a coworker of Kian's, a man named Tomas, who might want the ticket. Great, I thought, problem solved. Then she added, "But because I originally fronted the money, just send me the €92 now, and if Tomas confirms I'll transfer the ticket to him." I read that about 5 times because it made no sense. I replied, "I already paid you the €92 when you bought them." There was a long pause. Then she wrote, "No, you paid me for your share of the original booking, but now you're the one pulling out, so I'm not taking the financial risk for whether this gets sold." I actually stared at the screen and said, "What?" out loud in the office kitchen. I replied, "There is no financial risk to you. You've had my money for weeks." She said, "Yes, but if this guy backs out and we're left with an empty seat, then what?" I said, "Then I'm the one who loses, because I'm the one who already paid." She responded, "That's not how I see it." That sentence still enrages me because there are some situations where perspective matters and others where math should simply end the conversation. She had not been out of pocket for my ticket since the day I paid her. That was a fact. Her seeing it differently did not create a second €92 from nowhere. I asked her to explain what exactly she thought I owed her. She sent a voice note instead, which is one of her tactics when she wants plausible deniability later because tone gets slippery in audio. In it she said, in this very patient, maddening voice, that it was stressful for her to be dealing with the arrangement, that she had taken responsibility for organizing the night, and that it wasn't fair for her to feel like she was carrying uncertainty because I might or might not attend. She said if I wanted the ticket gone, I should make it whole by sending the money again now, and then if Tomas bought it, she would square it with me after. I sent back, Aoife, are you hearing yourself? You're asking me to pay twice for one ticket. She responded, no, I'm asking you not to make your change of plans my problem. At that point I called her because I thought surely this had to be one of those text misunderstandings where you hear someone's real logic out loud and it untangles. It did not untangle. She answered in a clipped tone and immediately said, I don't want to fight. I said, then please explain how you think I owe you money I already paid. She said, because you committed to coming. I said, yes, and then work and family happened, which I told you about. She said, that doesn't erase the commitment. I said, I'm not asking it to. I'm saying I already paid for the ticket, so if I can't use it, that's my loss. Not yours. She said, it becomes my problem because I'm the one left managing it. I said, managing what? Passing a ticket to someone else? You literally offered a coworker. Then she said something that really shifted the whole conversation for me. She said, you always do this. I asked what this meant. And she said, you're flaky when something more serious comes up in your life, and then everyone else has to adjust around you. That landed like a slap because first of all, what a thing to say when the more serious thing is my aunt in hospital and work insecurity. And second, it revealed that this was not about a ticket anymore. She had a file open in her head. We were suddenly in court over every prior inconvenience I may or may not have caused her. I said, what exactly are you referring to? She brought up my missing her birthday drinks last year after I got stuck in Ennis because my train was cancelled. She brought up a weekend in Sligo where I arrived late because my brother had a panic attack and I stayed with him until he calmed down. She even mentioned a brunch I skipped after a breakup because, in her words, everyone has stuff going on, Nora. It was one of the strangest conversations I've ever had, because I realized I was not talking to a friend who was frustrated in the moment. I was talking to someone who had quietly converted my worst days into evidence against me. I said, very carefully, there's a difference between being flaky and having real things happen. She said, there's always a reason with you. I replied, yes, that's how life works. Reasons happen. She exhaled loudly and said she couldn't deal with the stress. I said fine, then don't. I'm not paying twice, and if Tomas wants the ticket, great, sell it to him. If not, I'll keep trying elsewhere. She said she needed a clear answer immediately because if she couldn't count on me to be responsible, she'd just tell Tomas it wasn't available. I said, you know what? Tell him whatever you want. I'm not sending another cent. She hung up on me. I wish that had been the end of it, but the next day she started messaging Blanca and Marta privately. I know because Blanca, to her credit, told me. She sent me screenshots where Aoife said she was chasing me for ticket money and that I was refusing to cover my own mess. That phrasing is so manipulative it almost deserves academic study. It makes it sound like I was dodging a debt, when in reality the entire issue was me refusing to invent one. Blanca asked her directly, didn't Nora already pay you? And Aoife replied, that's not the point. Which, again, when money is being discussed, it actually is the point. Marta was less direct with me, but I could feel the shift immediately. She sent one of those messages people use when they want to sound neutral while already judging you. Hey, I'm sure there's just been a misunderstanding, but if it helps group vibes maybe it's worth just paying and moving on. Group vibes. I nearly threw my phone. I answered, would you pay twice for a train ticket you couldn't use just to maintain group vibes? She said, when you put it like that, no. Exactly. By then I was exhausted beyond proportion. I had the Cork workshop looming, my aunt still unsteady, and now this absurd social conflict metastasizing across multiple chats. Kian then got involved, which made everything worse because he's one of those men who speaks in a calm, measured tone that makes people assume he must be reasonable. He messaged me saying he thought both sides had contributed to the breakdown and that Aoife felt unsupported after doing all the organizing. He said maybe I could send her something partial, as a goodwill gesture, and then everyone could enjoy the concert without tension. I read that 3 times too. Something partial. A goodwill gesture. As if she were an event company and I'd breached contract. I replied that with respect, this was between me and Aoife, and I had already paid for my ticket in full. He said he understood, but he also understood why she felt taken for granted. That phrase came straight from her, obviously. It's one of her favorites. Anytime she's inconvenienced, even normally, she recasts herself as a martyr being used by less competent people. The day before the concert, I finally sold the ticket myself to a woman named Aliska from Prague who was in Dublin for the weekend and had posted desperately in a fan group looking for one seat anywhere. She sent the money immediately. I transferred the ticket. Done. Simple. Efficient. No crisis. No second payment. No heroic intervention by Aoife. I actually felt relief for about 40 seconds, until I messaged the group chat, "Ticket sold now, so all sorted. Hope you all have fun tomorrow," and Aoife replied, "Bit late for the stress but okay. No, glad it got sorted. No, sorry this became weird. Just one last little needle." I didn't answer. I spent that weekend in Cork smiling at clients and pretending to care about brand alignment while watching everyone's concert stories from a hotel room later that night. I won't lie, it stung. Not because I thought I'd made the wrong choice about work. I didn't have a real choice. But because it's always painful to watch your own life continue without you in little glowing squares on other people's phones. Blanca posted a video of the opening song. Marta had a photo of cocktails beforehand. Aoife posted one of the 4 of them with the caption, "Some people show up." I saw it, closed the app, opened it again because I thought maybe I'd imagined it, and no, there it was. That was when my sadness turned into anger. Because whatever minor ambiguity may once have existed was gone. This was not about admin stress. This was punishment. When I got back to Galway, I decided I wasn't going to do the usual thing I always do, which is smooth over tension because I'm uncomfortable with being disliked. I have spent too much of my life trying to become understandable enough that difficult people will finally be fair to me. It never works, so I sent Aoife one final message. I said that I'd had time to think, and I was genuinely shocked by how she handled the whole situation. I reminded her that I had paid her in full weeks before the concert, that I had never asked her to cover my ticket, and that trying to pressure me into paying again while telling other people I owed her money was dishonest. I said I was especially hurt that she threw deeply personal situations in my face as proof that I'm unreliable. I told her I didn't expect perfection from friends, but I did expect basic fairness and empathy, and I hadn't received either. She took hours to reply. When she did, it was a wall of text. In summary, her position was this. She had gone out of her way to organize something nice. I had created uncertainty. I had put emotional labor on her. I was now weaponizing technicalities about money to avoid accountability, and my message proved I was committed to misunderstanding her. She also said I'd embarrassed her by involving others, which was rich considering she'd been privately lobbying the group for support first. She ended by saying, "I'm sorry you feel hurt, but I also need friends who make my life easier, not harder." I read that last sentence about 10 times. Not friends who are kind. Not friends who are honest. Not friends who show up for each other. Friends who make her life easier. I think that was the cleanest truth she gave me in the entire friendship. I didn't answer. There wasn't anything left to say. What followed was that awful slow social aftershock people don't talk about enough. No one wanted to openly pick sides, which in practice means the person willing to be the most confident often sets the version of events everyone quietly absorbs. Blanca stayed warm with me, but more cautious. Marta drifted. Kian obviously stayed on Aoife's side. A few mutuals stopped inviting me to things if Aoife was going to be there because they didn't want awkwardness. Which, translated from social dialect, means it was easier to exclude the less combative person. The most painful part wasn't even losing Aoife exactly. By then I was seeing the friendship more clearly than ever. The painful part was realizing how quickly a group can decide that the easiest solution to one difficult personality is to let them define reality and work around them. A month later I ran into Blanca for coffee, just the 2 of us, and she admitted something I had suspected for years. She said Aoife often does this. She frames herself as the responsible one, then uses that role to claim moral authority whenever something goes wrong. If plans change, she isn't merely inconvenienced, she is wronged. If someone forgets something small, she stores it like evidence. If you challenge her, suddenly you're attacking the one person who makes everything happen. Blanca also told me that after the concert, on the train back, Aoife spent nearly 20 minutes complaining about me and saying I had basically stolen from her. Blanca finally snapped and said, "You had Norris money already, Aoife." Apparently Aoife went quiet for a bit, then said, "That's not the whole picture." Again with that, I asked Blanca what the whole picture was supposed to be, and she laughed in that tired way people do when they're too drained to decode someone else's nonsense anymore. She said, "I think the whole picture is she wanted you to feel guilty enough to prove she mattered." And that, honestly, hit close to something bigger. Because once I stepped back, I started seeing our whole friendship through a different lens. Aoife was generous, yes, but in a very specific currency. She liked giving when the giving established her as central. She liked solving when the solving made her indispensable. She liked organizing if everyone remembered she had organized. And if anything disrupted that, if plans changed, if gratitude wasn't immediate enough, if someone's crisis took precedence over her efficiency, she didn't just get annoyed. She got punitive. There were old examples I'd brushed off for years. When I couldn't make a New Year's cottage trip because I had COVID symptoms and didn't want to infect everyone, she spent days telling people I'd bailed on the non-refundable booking, even though I paid my share anyway. When our friend Ingrid lost her job and backed out of a weekend in Lisbon, Aoife said in front of everyone that some people always have an excuse when it's time to commit financially, which made Ingrid cry in the airport bathroom. When Kian once forgot to book a restaurant for her birthday after insisting he'd handle it, she retold the story for months like a funny anecdote, but with just enough edge that you knew it wasn't funny to live through. There's a type of person who builds their identity around competence so fiercely that they start treating every disappointment like betrayal. I think Aoife is one of those people. And because she is so articulate, so polished, so on top of things, it can take years to realize that what feels like reliability is sometimes just control in nicer clothes. I still haven't fully made peace with how much this affected me, which probably sounds ridiculous considering the original issue was under €100 and a concert ticket. But it was never really about that amount of money. It was about what happened when I had competing responsibilities and couldn't perform the exact version of friend she wanted. It was about how quickly empathy vanished once I became inconvenient. It was about being accused of dishonesty over a debt that didn't exist. It was about watching someone take actual facts and try to emotionally overpower them until everyone around us got tired enough to call it miscommunication. A few weeks after all this, my Aunt Zofia came to stay with my mother for recovery and I visited them both in Waterford. At one point we were having tea in the kitchen, and because my family has no boundaries in the old European way, my mother asked whether that concert girl had stopped being dramatic yet. I laughed and said no, not really. Zofia, who was still moving slowly but had lost none of her sharpness, said, "People who do favors with ledgers are not generous. They are bankers." That might be the cleanest summary of Aoife anyone has ever given me. So now we get to the part one still argue with myself about. Was I right not to pay her anything more? Logically, yes. Obviously yes. I had already paid. I eventually sold the ticket myself. She was never financially out of pocket for me. In accounting terms, there is no universe in which I owed her another cent. But socially, emotionally, friend politically, whatever you want to call it, I know exactly why some people think I should have just thrown money at the problem and walked away sooner. Because difficult people make refusal feel expensive. They create so much friction around their version of fairness that everyone starts confusing surrender with peacekeeping. If I had sent her another €20 or €40, or even the full amount again just to make her stop, some people would call that practical. Mature, not worth the fight, maybe, but I think there's a quiet cost to doing that too. Every time you pay a made-up debt to preserve harmony, you teach someone that pressure works. You teach yourself that your clarity is negotiable if the other person is exhausting enough. You turn truth into a personality contest. And I'm tired of losing those. What unsettles me most is how small the trigger was compared to what it exposed. If the friendship could survive years of history but not one cancelled concert and one invented debt, then maybe it had been hollowing out for much longer than I knew. Maybe I was useful to Aoife as long as I played the role she liked. Agreeable, appreciative, slightly less organized, someone who benefited from her decisiveness and therefore kept her comfortably above me in the balance of things. The second I said no, calmly, factually, repeatedly, something in her snapped because I was no longer validating her authority. And maybe the real reason I'm still thinking about it is because this has happened to me in subtler forms before. Not always with money, sometimes with family, work, exes. There are people who cannot tolerate a boundary unless it comes gift-wrapped in apology. The moment you say, "No, that isn't true," or "No, I don't owe you this," they act as if your resistance itself is the harm. Suddenly you're not the person refusing something unreasonable. You're the cold, difficult one who has made everything unpleasant. I used to fold fast in those situations. I used to rush to soften every no with 3 explanations and an offer to compensate emotionally for disappointing someone. This time I didn't, and I think part of why the fallout felt so intense is because people around me weren't used to seeing me hold the line. I still miss parts of the friendship sometimes. I miss the older version, or maybe the version I believed in. I miss texting someone who would instantly know what I meant if I said, "the red coat incident," or "that awful hostel in Bruges." I miss the practical intimacy of a long friendship, the accumulated references, the ease of shared history. Losing that over something that sounds so petty out loud feels almost embarrassing. But when I strip it back to the simplest version, I come back to the same place every time. I paid for a concert ticket. I couldn't use it because life happened. I tried to sort it. My friend tried to pressure me into paying for it again, then told people I owed her money, then treated my family's stress and work pressure like evidence of moral failure. That is not a misunderstanding. That is character.